worried, and the chain of command can be like, oh, we don't know who these guys are. We never saw them before, or we don't know what happened to them. It's not every officers and non-commissioned officers, and I mean, this is a human nature. It's not everyone uh, was gonna want to be held accountable for stupid fucking shit like that. So we decided to just not do it. And we had kept our strong links with the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. So after seeing this, we're like, okay, so if they decided to send us to the front without proper affiliation, well, if we had been put on blast a little bit last year because people were like, oh, you're not part of the official military, but we're part of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, which is an armed formation authorized by Zaluzhny himself. And under the law of national resistance, it's an armed formation that is authorized. And if you couple that with the new law that they passed on January 12th, 2023, that new bill states that any foreigner can apply directly to the armed formation of his choice without going with the international legion or any specific units that are made for foreigners, and you can apply there directly to an approved armed formation. So this is basically what I did. I went back my contacts there and I said, look, this is what's going on. They gave us a fucking shit proposal. There's no way we're just going to go there for 2 weeks as it goes. And if we live, we'll have the contract. It doesn't fucking make sense. So the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, obviously, they make proper IDs. They create those. We have a proof of affiliation. It's not under contract, but at least we have a lot more flexibility. So one way or another, once we get deployed on the front line, we get orders from a proper Ukrainian armed forces come in and control center. Okay, we get our warning orders. They ask us, okay, do you want to help us for this task? How would you do it? What would you want to do during this task? And they don't force us to do anything, and we choose how we want to help them. Compared to if you are on your contract, especially in the Ukrainian armed forces, if you are outnumbered fucking 3-1 and they tell you fucking storm that trench, well, you fucking storm that trench. But some foreigners use that, I would say, the privilege of having the right to revoke their contract. And this is a feedback that we've gotten in the last couple of days and weeks. And it makes sense because we already knew it, but the reputation that the foreigners have in Ukraine is so that shit hits the fan, they're going to just terminate the contract and they're going to move to another year. And the Ukrainians, when they see that, they get pissed off and they just think that foreigners in general are pussies. But it's a different reality, it's a different perspective, right? So I know I'm going far with this, but this is pretty much what's going on at the moment. So when it comes to taking rigid orders, we take rigid orders, but when it comes to serving and taking the right decision to have this operational freedom that we need to be able to help them smartly, it's up to us. So. Gotcha. Okay. And obviously they must have a lot of trust on you, with you after all this time, because you've proven yourself in combat, right? It comes from somewhere. The trust to bring that place to. And for the listeners, I would just say that regardless of you are, that's Ukrainian military intelligence, which of course it makes a lot of sense to have them embedded in centers with a foreign vetting process. Exactly. So there's an element of trust with people that I fought with. Units I fought with. Because obviously when we're getting a command and control center, I sat there with other battalion commanders. And we put together operations. to do is just kind of for those who maybe are really following the military situation here. Just maybe a brief discussion of kind of where we are. Someone from Zanzibar came here, who's been on an island in somewhere in okay, what's the latest in Ukraine? So, help us understand like where things at right now. I mean, what on a really high level. Absolutely. So I guess the most important fact to start with is that Russia has committed quite a bit of resources to their illegal invasion and genocide of Ukraine and Ukrainian citizens, but that they're not succeeding whatsoever, and that is very good news. Just to sort of put each party in one same sound bites, they do have old Soviet stockpiles where they have quite a number of various types of equipment and such. Music analysts on Twitter where people kind of make light of it and make fun of it. Every piece of equipment that they have is designed to be able to take someone's life. However, the Ukrainian resistance has been incredible, and there are deep-seated issues with corruption, both in the Russian government and in the Russian military, that have interfered with their ability to use what they have as effectively as it can be used. And that, in my opinion, is a very good thing, both for the people of Ukraine and also for the people who are fighting to free the land that Russia has illegally seized. So right now, there have been a couple of major phases where Ukraine is building up resources in order to go on major offensive and take territory back, and they're collecting the equipment that they're receiving from the West, from places like the US, UK, Germany, etc. And so there are certain operations of the size that can't be undertaken until they're properly resourced. And so one place that we saw this was the defensive gap in Kherson and west of Kherson, which is one of the reasons that Russia made inroads to very quickly at the start of the war. And so in the effort to take back that region, Ukraine needed to accumulate more resources than they had, and that is where some of the things that you saw in the news start to be very, very helpful. For example, HIMARS, rocket artillery systems, and things like that. At that time, Ukraine had far less than they had now. They had to use some infrastructure vehicles that are mine-resistant, and they can be disabled by mines that generally protect the occupants. And it had some artillery systems that are coming from the West that had these HIMARS, and they really made quite a lot with what they had, and were very successfully cleared out that region to the west of the Dnieper River, which is the largest river in Ukraine. And so now we're coming to a new phase where Ukraine has spent quite a lot of time and has been patient in a way that is even much more patient than a lot of the people who are watching the war come abroad. Right? I know looking at news and things like that, it's easy to get nervous because there are always articles and things that say, why aren't they making more progress? Why isn't this happening? Why aren't they taking this territory back? Why are we still waiting? But military operations are too important to be rushed. And so Ukraine needed to build up resources of material or equipment. It also needed to take time to properly train existing units and new units to be able to carry out the tasks that they need to execute in order to take this territory back. So it's a very difficult job. Not that anyone was fighting to have to do this, but it's critical. It's very important. And so we're now in a phase where it is important for us to continue supporting Ukraine and making sure that we are very supportive of the people because we have seen lives lost because of the Russians, because of what has gone on. And I'm glad we have people in this space to stand with the people of Ukraine and saying enough is enough. And let's really get back to the reality. And that is tomorrow is not promised. But we do know with all of us here today that the people of Ukraine has the love and support of each and every one of us. And not only that, but let's keep the commanders and everybody in our thoughts and prayers as they continue that fight. That fight that is long, long, long overdue, and sometimes is very brutal. But because of the support and love and understanding of all of us here today, we are true champions for the people of Ukraine. Thank you so much. Thank you for defending democracy in Europe and the world. Thank you. We're going to go to Christine and then Virginia. I just wanted to say that's a beautiful point, and I just wanted to add to it that all of us are here. All of us are able to do what we do because of people like this. Right? And people who are willing to sacrifice their lives for freedom, justice, liberty, rights. None of us would have any of the freedoms that we enjoy today. So like, the reason I'm able to live where I live and have the freedom to choose what I want to do is because someone else died for that, someone else sacrificed that, and that's so important to remember. So thank you so much. Absolutely, Virginia. First and foremost, I want to thank the commander for his sacrifice and his willingness to put his life on the line with himself and his group for the liberty of Ukraine.
you hear reference to the Budapest Memorandum and kind of what was the background behind it. I put it in the nest for people. There's sort of excerpt from that. If you Google it and look at Wikipedia and some other sites in the public domain, you can certainly look at find the actual text and get the more details. I just put that post up there as source material. But anyone who wants to speak to the background of the Budapest Memorandum and what that was all about, because it's relevant to how we got here today.
Yeah, so, a quick summary of the situation, although it's fairly complex if you dig into it, but just to put it at a bird's eye view, is that it was not often advertised that Ukraine was actually a large part of the brain power and muscle, both of the sort of military engine behind the USSR, as well as the nuclear program and their aerospace in general. And so, these are often touted as great achievements of Russia, but a lot of that is people confusing Russia, the country itself, with the USSR, and without the Ukrainians, most of this wouldn't have happened. So there was a situation after the USSR broke apart where in Ukraine there were still nuclear weapons, and it's not often talked about, but there were disputes not only over the nuclear weapons, but also over the Black Sea naval fleet and things like that, as well as strategic bombers that Ukraine still had. And so these weapons were still in Ukraine, but presumably the codes and control for them were still in Russia, but the physical control of them was on the territory of Ukraine. And so one of the most important things to know about the Budapest Memorandum, because I see this come up constantly, and 9 times out of 10, there's misinformation around it. So people like to say that Ukraine was given security guarantees in return for giving up the nuclear weapons that they had, for giving them back to Russia. However, this actually isn't true, and this is one thing that there was a video where Bill Clinton recently spoke on this and basically apologized for it. But what happened was the Ukrainian authorities actually wanted a stronger agreement with proper security guarantees. But the Western nations that were negotiating did not want to accept that risk. And so Ukraine was convinced to sign an agreement that on paper actually gave them no security guarantees. So if you look at what this document that was signed says, essentially it asked the signatories, so UK, Great Britain, Northern Ireland, US, to respect the independence and sovereignty of the existing borders of Ukraine. So that's kind of an agreement in principle, but it doesn't say what would happen if those borders were violated. The second point asked them to refrain from threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine. So this is essentially, it's like a handshake agreement, right? There's no, it's like saying, hey guys, don't do this. It's a bad thing. We all agree not to do this. But there's no strong provision for what happens if someone breaks that agreement. So the agreement goes on to say that if Ukraine is under a direct act of nuclear aggression, like someone's directly attacking them with nuclear weapons, or a threat of aggression, so there's a significant threat that someone's going to use nuclear weapons, that the only thing that's mandated to happen is that the people who signed the agreement ask the United Nations Security Council to provide assistance to Ukraine. Well, who sits on the United Nations Security Council? Russia, with veto power. And so what this means is that Ukraine was asked to sign an agreement and convinced not to accept stronger security guarantees, to sign an agreement that essentially says if Russia does anything, they're forced to ask a council that Russia sits on with absolute power to stop anything from happening for help. And so the fact that the agreement was weakened the way that it was, and the fact that Ukraine was basically coerced into signing this agreement, in large part helps lead to the situation that we're in now. There are no real security guarantees. The UN Security Council can't be trusted in a situation where Russia is involved to help. And there was nothing that was set up after this to actually, in a sort of hard codified way, protect the security and sovereignty of Ukraine. So we can be sure going forward that hopefully this will never happen again. And anything that happens after Ukraine wins the war, and I 100% believe that they will win the war, will be strong enough to make sure that there are firm words laid out to protect Ukrainian security and sovereignty in the case that it's tested by Russia ever again.
So, could it be argued that that there's a moral obligation for the U.S. to help participate to help Ukraine? One reason would be because of that we kind of sold them down the river in a way, right? Could we argue that?
100%. Everyone who put their signature and the name of their country on that document and was responsible for behind the scenes convincing Ukraine to accept something that didn't give them real security is now responsible for helping to correct the situation. And I agree 100%. It is a moral obligation of anyone who would convince a country to sign such a thing, now that things have gone wrong in the way that they have, to help out and to make sure that they're there for Ukraine, to make sure that they can secure their sovereignty again.
Yeah, even anything well codified will, if Russia is a signatory to it, they simply just break the treaty anyway. We see it all the time.
All right, and so basically, let's go through to the invasion. So basically, what happened in 2014 was that Russia invaded Crimea, right? So let's talk about that. You know what? So what was? So they just decided, hey, we're going to go ahead and take this territory, right?
Brian, can I add something in there before we leave that era too quickly?
Yes.
Just briefly. Okay. So another thing that I think America owes to both the need to remember that history and how things can be learned is that George Bush Sr. famously gave what was called the Chicken Kiev speech. And that the understanding in the psyche of America was largely focused on a stable Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was little concern for the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that pattern remained in the. So all of a sudden, this new consciousness of this country that we do not have this 20 plus years of treating the country with that mental capacity that would have also been a big part of how we got here. So I just wanted to add that in there because there's ample ways in which America talked about not just Ukraine, but other areas, other countries affected by the fall of the Soviet Union. They gave deference to Russia in a way that Russia exploited explicitly for all these years. Okay. And without that sort of adjustment, like, our desire, just like we heard this weekend about Prigozhin, our desire for stability typically trumps our awareness of the consequences of that to, for instance, satellite nations of the former Soviet Union, right? So I just want to make sure that was on the table, please.
Thank you. Great discussion. So I'm not sure it was Bloke or Professor that was first.
Professor.
Go ahead.
So one of the things, Crimson, great backstory there. One of the things that people often bring up but are vastly misinformed on was during the discussions on Budapest memorandum was that Russia wanted guarantees that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. But the reality of the situation is Russia was asking NATO not to expand into East Germany, not eastward expansion into former Soviet bloc countries. And this is talks with James Baker and footnotes and stuff. Nowhere in the Budapest Memorandum does it say NATO won't admit former Soviet bloc countries. This was never a promise. It was never made. It was never alluded to in private conversations, etc. In 2014, Mikhail Gorbachev gave an interview, and he said there was no promise, implied or otherwise, that NATO would not expand eastward. The promise was that NATO would not expand into East Germany. And to my knowledge, NATO has lived up to that promise to this very day.
And also, that was with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, which doesn't exist anymore, right? So it wasn't even Russia, it was the Soviet Union. It was still the Soviet Union at that time. So this talking point that, the West and NATO owns a piece of this because they basically backed Putin into a corner and sort of forced all of this into happen because Putin felt like he had no other choice. That's just a canard. It's not based in fact in how the sequence of events. Go ahead, Blok.
Hi, thank you. Those were all really great points. I just wanted to bring up one other, and that's about nuclear non-proliferation. So it's really important to remind everyone that Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. And if we're to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we have to show that a country can do that and they will be defended. So I just thought I'd throw that in there. Thank you.
All right. There was someone else?
Rolf put his hand up for a second, but Crimson had his hand up. And Crimson, let me say, it's really great to hear your voice. It's been quite a while, and man, you are so talented at distilling very complicated subjects into layman's terms. It's formidable, to say the least. Thank you for being here. Whichever one of you guys, you're both big boys, figure it out.
I'll defer to Norman, and also it's good to see you all as well.
Thank you. Crimson can probably also confirm with this. When it comes to that narrative that Putin didn't have a choice to invade, I would say it's a half-truth. And where I'm going with this is that I'm not sure, I don't remember which guy predicted it, but I think in 2017 he had come up with a mathematical formula in which he predicted that Russia in 2022 would have absolutely no choice to expand, to invade. He didn't predict if it was going to be the Baltics or Ukraine, but the demographic problem of Russia dictated that in 2022, it would have been the point of non-return for Russia. We all know how the demographic is in Russia. There are more women than men, low wage, poor life, how do you say that? The quality of life is so poor that people, if you look at the demographic, like they die faster than we do in the West. And if you look at the pattern that has been going on, Putin has been emptying like the prisons. I don't know. I pretty sure remember, guys, when he addressed that speech when the war started, and he said, there's going to be a big cleanup on the societal level. And this is what he was talking about. He literally just emptied the prison, immobilized the drunks, basically what a Russian leadership would consider probably useless. And there was a massive influx of Ukrainian population in eastern Ukraine, where people were forced to go to Russia. They were sent to different locations. Families were split apart. And it's basically assimilation. And if you look at, obviously, the genetic profile of this population, it's basically, I would say, the same. So for Putin, it's more of an existential fight, but also a genetic fight, where this aspect of the great white Russia, the last white bastion ethno-nationalist state is very strong, and it's very subtle, but if you start putting the pieces together, you would realize that it doesn't matter to Putin if he loses 1 million fucking soldiers, because to them they are expendable, and on the other hand he was able to get probably 1.5 million Ukrainian back to Russia. So for him, demographically, he's still in the positive, and it's not going to stop until we fucking break that state apart, until they are split in 110 fucking republics and can no longer fucking hurt people. That was my 2 cents.
Thank you. Well said. Crimson.
Yeah, that pattern is so important, to not look at just the most recent event, but to look at what they've done throughout history, even recent history. And it's a very clear pattern of interfering in the affairs of other nations. And to underscore the point about NATO expansion as well, I think this is one of the most important things to understand, is that the number one way that NATO expands is because countries request to join. And in fact, there are far more countries that would like to be part of NATO than have been able to join NATO. So if it were up to those countries, NATO would be even larger than it is. And if it were purely just about expansion, NATO could have accepted a number of other countries into the fold. So, countries have to request to join, and there's a very long process. Some might argue too long, that a number of them have had to go through once they sort of apply to join. And so when you see this in the news with Ukraine being ready to join NATO after the war and things like that, part of what's being discussed is how to take this process that has actually been incredibly long and arduous, and in some cases hasn't even been able to be started by countries that would like to join, and how, in light of everything that Ukraine has shown this far, and their clear willingness to adhere to democratic values, and also to really, be responsible for the defense of Europe in some way at great risk to themselves. Part of the discussion now is how to adjust this process for them so that they don't have to go through this long and drawn out process of joining. And so all of this speaks to the fact that it's really not about NATO just pushing themselves onto every other country to get closer and closer to Russia, but that countries request to join, and the reason they request to join is because of what Russia has been doing for years and decades, which is exactly what Norman is talking about. And then the last thing I want to say is the reason that the kinetic war, or the active fighting war that started in 2014 began is because Russia lost another war. And that wasn't a kinetic war, it was a war to control the politics and the government of Ukraine. And so, there's a long history that I won't go into all of it, but essentially Ukraine has been trying to determine its own direction for quite some time, and Russia has been interfering with that by installing people who they wanted to be in prominent positions in government for quite some time. And that battle has gone back and forth, and it culminated with Yanukovych, who stalled the will of the Ukrainian people to join the rest of Europe. And the Ukrainian people were fed up with it, and they decided, no, we will not allow Russia to install people as the head of the country who will cave to Russian interest over the will of our own people. And so that resulted in the rebellion that happened in 2014, and that is the reason why Russia invaded. It's not any of this other stuff. It's that they first tried to control Ukraine from the inside out. They failed. The Ukrainian people beat that and stood up against it and said, we refuse to be intimidated. And it was exactly at that moment that Russia then decided to invade.
Wait, you mean it wasn't a CIA-backed coup?
Good one. I like that. I like what you did there. Go ahead, Billy.
All right. I would like to just kind of jump on what Norman was talking about. So, considering, well, first of all, considering about demographic issue. I mean, it's first of all, if we just look at purely just what Russian soldiers have been sent to Ukraine, it's overwhelmingly. I mean, we're seeing in some these ethnic minority states, you're seeing 75 times more people from these areas going to Ukraine and dying compared to what the central Russia heartland and like around Moscow. And so he's through this. They're eliminating the male population of these nations, and this is kind of goes along with this has been a long process of assimilation, deportation. This was done throughout the Russian Empire, throughout the Soviet Union, and continued today. I mean, even when Russia took over Crimea, like the Crimean Tatars were deported from Ukraine not deported officially like they were previously, but they were pretty much forced out of Crimea for the third time in the last couple hundred years. But I would like to give some background so if you didn't know. So I lived in Russia for well over a decade. My ex-wife, who's from Moscow, she's actually Ukrainian, and her family's from Ukraine, from Eastern Ukraine. And it was very bizarre being in.
Billy, one sec, Brian. You've got a hot mic, and you're the one person I can't mute.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, you can mute everyone. All right, he still has a hot mic, but it's really bizarre being in Moscow or being in Russia in 2014 when Russia took Crimea and when the war in Donbass started. So first of all, before 2014, there really wasn't a border between Russia and Ukraine in like I would say there was like Canada and the United States have a border. Russia and Ukraine at the time really didn't have a border. There were really no border controls for the most part. People just go back and forth. A lot of people who lived on the Russian side were Ukrainian. A lot of people who lived on the Ukrainian side were Russian, and so like traveling to Crimea, for example, was never ever an issue for any Russians. And I knew a lot of Russians had vacation in Crimea before 2014. But I remember when Russia took Crimea, I heard this sentiment over and over again. Oh, I'm so glad that now we can travel to Crimea finally. As if they were like unable to. And in fact, it was the fervor that was in the air was really, really frightening. Because, I mean, even I talked to like my ex-wife's family, her mother whose home was in Ukraine, but she grew up in, and her grandmother grew up, and her mother grew up in, and her grandmother grew up in, and which village is now gone. It's Sumy Oblast, but the Russians destroyed at the beginning of last year. But I was like, you realize that like Russia is invading. Russia just took Crimea. Russia is invading Ukraine. Like, how do you feel about this? And it was very bizarre seeing people who a year before would have said, Ukrainians are our brothers. They're a brother nation. They really did it. And the overall population like felt that Ukraine was like, they're buds, like U.S. and Canada kind of, but even closer. But then switched. And I remember in 2014, I hear all of these people would stop referring to Ukrainians. There was this hachol, and they were just, how tricky they are, and then we got to stop them, and they're Nazis, and it was just everybody. And I don't want to say, and these are even educated people, like people like professors that I worked with had these thoughts, and I'm like, what the hell? And Putin's popularity just exploded. And it's very, very bizarre because the Russian population supports this war. They really do support this war. But I think it's kind of going down a little bit now because a lot of body bags are coming back. But overall, they do support the war. But it's in this really abstract, like they don't really see that Ukraine is their neighbor anymore. To them, Ukraine is just some faraway country, and it's like, yeah, Russia's doing great, Russia's powerful. And it's this real cultural love of desire of being powerful. I mean, they feel like this just great humiliation because of the end of the Soviet Union, and they feel now they're a proud nation again. And I heard even today, I talked to some I communicate with a lot of Russians still, and I hear some of these thoughts are like, I don't support the war, but we can't lose because it's going to be too shameful for the nation, which is just so bizarre because, I mean, Russia overall is not a united country. People don't like, it's not like people aren't citizens of that country. People are just people who live there. But suddenly they feel like it's very important that they don't get embarrassed. And I mean, so this is like I try really hard to spread as much news and videos about Russia that paint it as negatively as possible because I don't want anyone to feel like nobody was, what's the word before?
Sympathy.
Sympathy. There we go. Sympathy. Thank you, bro. Feel sympathy for the Russians. I really don't. And even with these Russian freedom fighters and whatnot, believe me, they're all kind of the same group. They have the same mentality. Not every Russian is like this. That is true. But a lot of those people have left already, or they're quiet and they're keeping their heads down. But please, guys, if we need to focus our attention on Ukraine, support Ukraine, and even if we see some Russian freedom fighters doing some stuff in Belgorod, that's great. But we don't need to be raising money for them. They are their own thing. They're kind of, I don't want to say what their political leanings are, but it's not great. And we should focus all our attention on Ukraine, and Russia deserves zero of our sympathy because they love this war. They like being imperialistic. It's just part of their culture. It really is. Their literature is about this. They just praise how they took over the Caucasus, how they destroyed, cut the heads off the Tatars. It's a very bizarre culture, and this is something that we really need to understand understand what the enemy is, who the enemy is. It's not just some evil Putin. No. It's a whole society. Putin didn't create this war, and Putin didn't make the population the way it is. Putin came to power because the population is the way it is. All right, thank you.
That was really insightful, Billy. Thanks. It's a might is right attitude, and that's a very simplistic way to look at the world, in my opinion. But thanks for helping everyone understand that, and I think it's really important for everyone to understand that. Brian, I may have cut you off. Sorry about that.
No, I was just going to go to Redstone. You were fine. Redstone.
I have a question for Crimson. Just going off of his last bit of history of chain of events, I was wondering what your opinion versus, I don't know if there's any fact on this, but what is your opinion on the 2022 invasion timing? Was that delayed by COVID or anything, just the economics of the global shutdown in a sense, or was this staged and placed based on political events going on around the same time?
It's a good question. Honestly, I don't know the answer. Yeah, I don't think there are a lot of people that are privy to the reasons behind the exact timing. All I will say is that it was clearly in progress for a while. And again, not just militarily, right? Because obviously a lot of people start to take note based on the buildup of troops on the borders. But even internal actions that were taken to make sure that they're favorable people in certain places, to prepare things, propaganda, all this stuff was years in the making, and it parallels the rest of the war since 2014. So yeah, as far as the reasons for exact timing, I'm not sure we know, but it was definitely something that was in progress for quite a while.
And do you think the movement of heavy armor, I guess MRAPs, tanks, etc., when, I would say before the news caught wind of this, where there was satellite images that we were all looking at, when the State Department maybe was made privy of this, when, the CIA had knowledge of unusual movements around, Russian military sites that seemed unusual, even though there was, a war, a small proxy war going on since 2014. I wonder, were those events that just those formations would have taken months long to prepare?
So can I jump in here, Redstone? So one of the things that a lot of people don't remember is that Russia was building up their tanks and stuff in the spring of 2021, and there was a real fear that there would have been like an invasion at that point. And they kind of, for whatever reason, they didn't go through with it. And according to intelligence releases, that like, the U.S. knew that Russia was going to invade by July 2021, so 7-8 months before the actual invasion. So this was, as says militarily, they were replacing, like they were just moving huge amounts of equipment and setting them in the field to just wait for, and this was happening in the spring of 2021, so over about a year before the actual invasion.
And they couched this by saying that it was an installment of their periodic Zapad military exercises. However, there are a couple signs that this wasn't the case. One was that this was much larger than any previous exercise that Russia had undergone. And the second was that what they were actually doing, right? Like this war is evidence of the fact that to coordinate all the units that you have in the military that large to work together to accomplish a common goal in a smooth way, you actually have to practice it. It's not simply a matter of let's move all these units to these places and make a big show, right? Like you need to drill the things that you're going to have to do to coordinate, and they actually weren't doing that. They moved a lot of armor. They made a huge show. What if you were looking for the things that a military would need to do to coordinate all the different parts of the hierarchy of the Russian military, the divisions, brigades, regiments, etc., together in an effective way? They didn't do any of that. So all of that was a sign that this was a front, and there were people in Ukraine who were, some of them fighting in Ukraine, some of them in the government, who said, listen, it's only a matter of time, the invasion is going to happen, and they were preparing for this for quite some time.
Right, and the agency knew, but the date they had was 2 days before they actually did the invasion. So Russia was late on their invasion by 2 days.
Can I ask one more question to Crimson or even 69 or Par?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. I'm not trying to drag politics into this, but it is a question that sort of regards party a little bit in the United States. Does this sort of suggest then, based on what is that regardless of who the president of the United States was, regardless of who was prime minister in England, this was set in motion. Gold was stashed away. They were going to weaponize oil and gas infrastructure, pipelines, etc. This was just going to happen regardless of who was in power. Is that kind of an understatement at this point?
Well, I can say about the oil and gas issue. So Putin wrote his master's thesis on using oil and gas as a political tool. So I think that was always in the works with that.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
Billy facts.
Those are real facts. Billy facts are just bullshit. That's a real fact.
I think it was Kate and then Professor.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Brian. Thanks for this wonderful space.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to comment on when we talk about Russia's military invasion of Ukraine, which started in 2014, and we wonder, what started this. We can even look back all the way at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even with Putin to the very beginning of his presidency in Russia. And just according to Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak, he has stated that even at the fall of the Soviet Union, within Yeltsin and his inner circle, that they had the feeling that, okay, they would let Ukraine go, but because at some point they felt Ukraine would just come crawling back because they would not be able to survive without Russia. And I'll try to find a link to that interview with Professor Fritzak. But also then when Putin comes into power in the early 2000s, he visits Ukraine and he campaigns for Yanukovych and spends lots of money campaigning for him, even going twice to Ukraine to campaign for him. So I think for Russia, it's basically Ukraine, and for Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union, according to him, is one of the greatest travesties that's ever occurred, which is quite a horrible thing to say, knowing the 60 million people who died under Soviet repression in one form or another, famine, deportations, Great Terror, etc. But that now they're moving militarily because the influence he tried to gain over Ukraine politically rather failed. Yanukovych, in 2004, there was the Orange Revolution and the fraudulent election there. But they have always been meddling in Ukraine, and a free, democratic, Western-leaning Ukraine is a threat to Russia because it shows the Russian people and other, Slavic people under repressive authoritarian regimes, Belarus included, that people can live well and freely. So that Ukraine was a threat in that manner, seeking democratic life. And also then that continues, there's even Russia actually sort of made a mini invasion in 2003. You can look up the Tula island incident where there's in the Kerch Strait between there at Crimea, between Crimea and mainland Russia, there was this little island called Sula that was very close to mainland Russia. And Russia started building a dam to Tula Island because at the time, Ukraine had authority over the Kerch Strait into the Sea of Azov. And Russia did not like that. So they started building a dam. And then President Kuchma, they eventually put a stop to that, sent military, threatened to send the military in. And then they had some pact where Ukraine and Russia had joined authority over that strait. But it just, now things have escalated militarily, but Putin has, campaigning for Yanukovych in 2003, 2004, and then, we have Manafort coming in to become Yanukovych's political advisor, and there's connections to funding from Russia for Paul Manafort to help transform Yanukovych into, then he has a successful campaign and becomes president again, who Putin backs. So they've been just trying to keep that sphere of influence in Ukraine. Always that has failed. And now this is sort of their last chance because you have an entire generation of Ukrainians who have grown up outside without being part of the Soviet Union. And it's sort of the last chance to suck Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence. So I would just suggest also, knowing history too helps us see these matters now clearly. And Professor Yaroslav Hrtsak, Oksana Shevel at Tufts University, there's numerous Ukrainian historians that help us get a clear picture of all the ways Russia has tried to maintain influence in Ukraine. Thank you.
All good points. Professor, and then Ocean 69.
Oh, I was just following up on the weaponization of oil and gas. That goes all the way back to kind of the 70s with the Saudi oil embargo was kind of the start of it. Russia kind of just refined it and was able to use it more of a scalpel as opposed to a very large sledgehammer as it was before, because the way the OPEC used it in the 70s was more of a global market assault versus, Russia employs it more as a strategic scalpel. I was just kind of throwing that in there.
Great. So who was next? Yeah, go ahead, Ocean 69.
Okay, so yeah, I'm sorry I'm skipping around, but you're remind me a few things. So yeah, Russia had been fucking with Ukraine for a very long time. I mean, since the 17th century. There's actually a Wikipedia article, and you can see. Oh, I think it looks about 50 different laws that were passed from the 17th century up until the 21st century that were restricting the use of Ukrainian language in Ukraine. As we know that Ukraine was conquered by the Russian Empire and became part of the Russian Empire. So there's a very long history of that. I mean, and the Holodomor is just a very extreme example. But even if you think about why is Eastern Ukraine Russian speaking, and why are there so many, like, let's say, quote unquote, ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine, particularly around in the Donbass, because even before the revolution in the Russian Empire, there was an effort to move ethnic Russians, into the Donbass, into the Donetsk area, to populate it, to create the greater Novorossiya, as they would call it, the new Russia. And we also cannot forget about Russia poisoning the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, in 2004, I believe. Which is normally when you poison another country's president, that's not like a cool thing to do, but hey.
So we had this invasion, and so the Ukrainians, responded as best they could at the time. So they had, an armed force that resisted. Then at the time, go ahead, and Intel, did you want to chime in on this particular topic before we moved on? Intel,
mic check.
Can you hear me, bro?
Yeah, you're a little robot-y.
He may be driving.
69 was saying.
Okay, never mind.
Which was about the Russians in the Donbass, right? It's like, where did those people go? Like, when the Russians repopulated the Donbass with Russians, where did the Ukrainians go? The ones that weren't killed or starved were deported to the Russian Far East. Go to, say, like Vladivostok or Sakhalin. Like, almost 40% of the population in Sakhalin is ethnic Ukrainian. And then you might ask, well, what happened to the people in Sakhalin? Those were the Ainu. Where did the Ainu go? Well, the Russians either killed the Ainu, or the ones they didn't kill, they deported to Japan at the end of World War II.
Thank you for that. All right, so we basically had the invasion in 2014, and then the Ukrainians resisted as much as they could. Then there was this thing called Operation Unifier, right? Haruf and I talked about this earlier. So this Operation Unifier was, as I remember it, it was a coalition of Western militaries that led by Canada, if I remember correctly, and they, including the U.S. and some of the other NATO countries, and they undertook a years-long effort to train the Ukrainian military and sort of help in its reimagining, reimagining, I guess, is a decent characterization, but essentially teaching them Western fighting techniques, strategy, doctrine, combined arms, importance of a non-commissioned officer corps. I'm getting out of my depth pretty quickly here because I'm not a military background, but please, Intel or any of the other folks here, correct me if I have misspoken. But I believe that was, and I know Colonel Lake over at the Maria Report was involved in those efforts personally, being a liaison officer with the Ukrainian military. But over a period of years, what was kind of a totally different military than it is today was sort of transformed, and it wasn't easy, I'm sure, for the people that were involved, into something that would more closely resemble a Western military structure and way of doing things. Have I butchered that, or is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think you got it right, and I think also the command and control aspect, logistics and planning, I think is also included in that. And I think partially one of the miscalculations made by the Russians was how much they improved in that period of time from 2014 to 2022, and I think they learned that quickly on the battlefield.
Go ahead, Kumamoto.
Hey guys, I just want to add a little bit. Keep in mind that this war is completely asymmetrical, right? To be fair, no military in the world knows how to protect themselves from drones. Why I'm saying that, like, if you take a look at the modernizations of the Russian tanks, the modern Russian tanks, we're talking about T-80s BVM and the later ones, they are using E-array on top of a turret. Because there is such thing as the first of all top-down turret, top-down rockets like javelins, and if I'm recalling correctly, the TOW-2B, which flies above the target, if someone can correct me. So what we see in Ukraine is usage of drones, basically aka small cruise missiles like TV guidance or whatever you call it, like whatever you want to call it, neglecting completely the protective measures of the Russian tanks. So not just Russian tanks, I would say no tank is safe from such type of attack even right now, except of maybe Merkavas, which will go on a hot kill protection, and more modern modifications, basically. So, also, you're correct. Russia definitely underestimated the reforms made in Ukrainian army, but we have to keep in mind that Russia is learning from its mistakes too, and we see already getting these scope cages, like how we call them, and probably laughing them. They're somewhat effective because the reason why that scope cage is existing is to catch the drone which is flying to the turret again. What I'm trying to say is I'm actually looking forward to see modifications to tanks after results of Ukrainian war, because the modern warfare basically has changed during these 2 years, and we see that drastic change happen really fast. We already see a lot of anti-drones weapons deployed. We already see a lot of drones, the personal drones deployed. So, as I said, this is completely asymmetrical warfare, and I'm just actually interested in the results of that.
Thank you for that. Crimson.
Yeah, I just had a quick addition to the point about the Ukrainian military's transformation, which is that, like, what Ukraine has had to do is a fairly difficult task, and it's not something that stopped, in 2022, right? It's an ongoing task. It's one that still applies today, and so when you listen to the Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny speak, it's something that is very much a priority for him. And the reason why is that, number one, Ukraine has had to do this while fighting the entire time, right? That's no small task. It's pretty amazing. In addition to that, it's not like a change that happens in every unit all at the same time. So, a military of this size, all right, they're people that have been in positions of power for different amounts of time, going from, say, like brigade leadership all the way up to the very top of the general staff. And so changing this isn't something where you snap your fingers and all of a sudden the entire culture is different, and it's something that continues to happen on an ongoing basis. But one thing that I think is really cool is that some of Ukraine's best and most experienced units have started as volunteer units. And Ukraine has found ways to transform the enthusiasm and the courage of people into a formal part of the military structure and to reward that. And that is the exact opposite of what you see in Russia, where they're rewarding their friends, are people who don't rock the boat. And I think that is one of the reasons why Ukraine will win this war.
Herluf?
Yes. So that Operation Unifier, they revamped their NCO's core very, very well. It was basically the backbone, and one of the main goal of that operation is to push the Ukrainians to have a decentralized command, to make sure the NCOs were able to take decisions, to fight more effectively, to lead their men more effectively. But I remember Canadians saying how they were like, there was no way they could have teach the Ukrainians how to fight in a war that they were already fighting. All what they could do is basically open their mind to a better management and situational awareness and also management on the battlefield. Probably also how they helped when it comes to the officer corps is probably to implement new technologies in command and control. Also to allow probably a little bit of decentralization on higher hubs, because I don't know if you've seen the only interview that Zaluzhny gave a couple months ago. When the invasion started, all what he had to do is basically call and be like, okay, this is the situation, all we set up, okay, everybody, you know what to do, etc., etc. He didn't have to dictate which battalion, which battalion will go at that point. This is how it was. But still, in the Ukrainian army, you still have what we call that dinosaur mentality. And Zaluzhny, obviously, his goal is to push that mentality out. But they went, from a professional army of 100,000, 200,000 maximum to literally 700,000, 800,000 people. So this NCO core has been, how do you say that, distillated, has been spread out in different units.
Disseminated.
Yeah, disseminated. And obviously, we had some losses. A lot of good NCOs died. But mainly this is the reason why they were able to stop the invasion when Russia invaded. It's because it was so decentralized, and the initiatives that the NCOs took on the battlefield probably came from that new culture that Operation Unifier tried to bring into the Ukrainian army, especially when it comes to NCO Corps. This is really where it make a big difference. I think now it's time for Ukraine, obviously, to keep going on the offensive, but not going crazy and not pushing too much, because obviously there's still a lot of work to do in the rear when it comes to educate these NCOs and to educate also the new class of junior officers who's going to come out of officer school, who obviously will have to learn from the warriors. So,
excellent points. We have one more. Willie, can I rotate you out? I can bring you back. We have more speaker requests than we have available slots.
Fine. I understand. Well, but I'll do that.
Oh wow, lost it. Sorry, I was having a private conversation in the background. Oh yeah, Mark's trying to come up.
All right. So next, I think was Shovel.
Don't worry, Billy. I won't stay up here for long. There were just 2 points I wanted to bring everybody's attention to. just to backtrack slightly a little bit, before leading up to the invasion in 2022, I do think there were two other factors. Redstone kind of was getting onto this, but I really do think, and I don't know if you'll ever be able to prove it, but considering Manafort was involved with the Trump campaign and the administration's buddy-buddiness with Russia, and their interference in politics in Ukraine, I think that once Trump lost, I think Putin saw a window of opportunity closing to some extent, and Trump and his administration had really kind of destabilized NATO, and luckily Biden was able to coalesce it back together. And I mean, he had valid points, but at the same time, like, that was a threat to Putin. And then the other factor was Russia had been, poking and interfering and invading several other areas in their near vicinity, like Chechnya and Georgia, and then, finally Crimea, and then they've even been interfering or keeping Assad in Syria. So, like, they've been going about most of what they're doing unchecked. And I think they saw it as, oh, well, we've done it so far. I wonder what's going to happen now, or he didn't have the full intel, obviously, but that had to have been another factor. Like, no, he hadn't gotten swatted down before then. And that's all I wanted to point out.
All right, so who was next? I think Mark. Mark, why don't you go? You haven't spoken yet. Go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Brian, can you hear me?
You're good, Mark.
Oh,
you're good, Mark.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I just see I'm just on listener status. So I kind of had a question for the military types. Maybe Crimson is in a good position to answer this. Maybe National or anybody else with experience. But I've been watching more and more of these videos of these GoPro cameras of the Ukrainians storming the Russian trenches, and it's horrifying. It's horrifying to see this close-up combat with grenades being tossed back and forth within 15 or 20 feet. I can't imagine the courage it takes to storm these trenches, and there's thousands of these trenches. So I've concluded in my mind, rightfully or wrongfully, that if Ukraine had F-16s, that kind of removing Russian from their trenches would be a lot easier. And I'm very, very, very frustrated that the U.S. is dragging its feet on the F-16s. Incredibly frustrated. And I'm a big Biden fan, for whatever that's worth, but I'm just pissed. So this is what my question is for those with the military knowledge. If Ukraine had those F-16s now, would it make removing Russians from their trenches a lot easier and smooth out and making the counteroffensive go a little quicker with less risk to Ukrainian soldiers?
Erlof, since you're on the front line, you might have something to say about that.
So for a pilot, it's kind of hard. Let's say you would have a F-15, right? 16 with, or even F-18 with JDAMs or guided missiles. You would probably use it on high, like on concentrations of troops in the open or a fortified building or this kind of thing. To attack trench, honestly, if you have a proper combined arm format with proper mortar support, with base of fire, mobile base of fire, with a swift decisive action, where you can get also, you could use, you know, the M777 with guarded artillery if you want, guided rounds to hit, let's say, fortified bunkers, and then you could get close to the positions that you want to storm. Okay, you can even use tanks, BTRs. You always need sustained base of fire, and you need to get close enough. And this is what combined arm is. Okay, you have to get the enemy pinned down so you can get to your zone operation, and you just clear what remains there. Okay, the infantry is there to finish the job. Okay, to get very close to the enemy. So I don't see a F-16 clearing out a trench. It would probably be used. It could probably be done by an helicopter with, you know, different rockets and different machine guns. But F-15 or 16, 18, that would be used, you know, for much more high-value targets. Also, keep in mind, the Russians, they are no jokes when it comes to anti-air capabilities, right? Especially high altitude and mid distance altitude. Sorry for my shitty English. So you need to create that permissive environment, and especially when you have like batteries like 100, 200 kilometers behind the lines, or you have book 1, 2, who are probably at like 40 kilometers. You have to deactivate these things. So if you cannot get close to it, you cannot use air support. So you would have to use partisan action. You would have to coordinate different behind enemy lines actions to either force them to move or to attack them and to disable these anti-air capabilities. So you need to create that window. And this window usually it's in a matter of, you know, half hour, an hour, maximum hour and a half. These windows will be closed. Also, you have to think that the Russians will dispatch also airplanes, you know, to counter your action. So you're not going to use precious F-16 just to bomb a fucking trench. We have much more other means to do it. We just need ammunition, rounds. We need proper capabilities so we can achieve combined arms. And the Ukrainians, they're not expert at it. They are starting to get better, especially with the new junior officers that are starting to learn it the hard way. But the mentality in Ukraine is you protect the artillery. It's not the artillery that supports you. And some brigade commanders, especially with the artillery, brigade like detachment artillery, when you send a fire mission request, it's, if you follow the bureaucracy, it will probably take 15 minutes. They're gonna analyze what you're trying to fucking destroy, and they would probably just be like, okay, go fuck yourself. We're not gonna spend rounds on this, or they will probably just tell you no if they're polite enough. So that's why the Ukrainians should probably implement like mortar platoons at company level, which they don't have. They don't have this flexibility. Their structural layout is very rigid. So yeah, I'm drifting a little bit. But yeah, it's very hard to work with combined arms in Ukraine because the artillery basically decides if it's worth hitting or not. So no, F-16s will not change the dynamic of clearing trenches.
I think Bloke was next. Oh, I'm sorry. Sumamoto. Sorry.
Oh, Brian, could
Yeah.
I add one small tidbit to that?
Okay, just real quick, and then Sumamoto.
Okay. First, I just wanted to clarify quickly and say I'm super civilian. I'm not speaking from military experience, so for that reason, it's good to have Wolf here in addition to everything else that he brings. But I wanted to say also, if you look at the Ukrainian Air Force's stated reasons for why they would like F-16s. Part of it is being better able to protect the troops on the front line as they're doing their jobs. And the truth is that Ukraine does not have enough air defense, both like medium and longer range air defense, but also SHORAD. And then Ukraine doesn't have enough precision strike capability, right? So they've gotten some capabilities now, but we're not sure how much. And so that limits how much they're able to do at one time. And so the Air Force themselves has expressed that, number one, having a better ability to counter Russian aviation, which are currently launching these modified, sort of imitation JDAM modified fabs where they put these wing kits on them and send them to the front lines. So to better keep Russian aircraft out of the range where they can launch these things to be able to affect what's happening on the front line. And then also to be able to better counter rotary wing aviation as well, and to have additional capabilities for better radar and better missiles. So to allow them to pick up threats from farther away, which helps the Ukrainian aircraft be able to stay safer as they have the effect that they have on Russian aircraft. And also for anti-radiation capabilities. So to be able to launch missiles that intercept Russian radar from their air defense and be able to take those systems out with harm and things like that. So any expansion that helps the Ukrainian Air Force in those areas will help them keep the troops more safe on the front lines. So even if they aren't directly launching them against trenches or whatever, being able to keep Russia from doing the things that can make a unit ineffective is a big help. And so a good example of that is everyone's seen these videos of what happened to, I believe it was a company or battalion from the 47th Brigade at the front lines recently, where there were those destroyed Bradleys and things like that. So it wasn't just the mines, but it was the fact that they had to deal with Russian helicopters launching anti-armor weapons at them from a range that's just outside the range of most like short-range air defense. And so I just say this to understate what Hrull said, that it's not just one thing that happens at one time, but it's the combination of everything that has to be dealt with at a time. And so F-16s play a role in that, even if it's an indirect one. It's still connected.
That's helpful for sure. Sumamoto and then Bloke and then Professor.
Yeah. Okay. I might say something which many people wouldn't like, but I currently don't see F-16 being useful in Ukrainian front, except of maybe integration with more Western munitions like Storm Shadow and other type of high precision long range missiles, including HARMS and others. The problem is, as Norman Brigade said absolutely correctly, and I know that for a fact too, the Russian anti-air defense is basically pride and glory of the Russian army. They really care about it a lot. So we see in Ukraine a lot of area of denial zones created by such air defense. Plus, because right now we don't see much air targets for Russians to shoot, they use the S-300, S-400 missiles as for ground strikes. That's why they not usually used like that. It's like illogical, right? So the problem with F-16 is, I think United States think that Ukraine will just lose them in that, because again, S-300, S-400 are very capable anti-air systems, and they are actually pretty good. I would say it like that, right? that's the problem with usage of F-16s. And again, I want to support Norman Brigade on that. He said it correctly. F-16s wouldn't be used for trenches. Seriously. First of all, you will not fly to that trench because you will get shot down. And second of all, the bomb will be used for much more high-value targets like tanks, command centers, etc. Because I might be an armchair warrior, but I think I just know that for a fact. The manpower considered as a lowest priority target. And there are much more important targets like armor depots. There are much more important targets like tanks, like supply depots, FOBs, everything like that. And for manpower, usually you need to have mortars, you need to have more artillery, and basically artillery solved the problem. As I read a lot of articles about that, there was a correct comparison to this war to the World War One, with a lot of trenches and artillery, and that's absolutely correct. Plus, the trenches itself, if you take a look how they are looking like, they're zigzag-like. Therefore, even if you will strike it with a bomb, you will just take out one section of that trench, and the other sections will be completely fine, so you didn't achieve your target. Usage of Geneva prohibited weapons is also out of the option for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's not such for Russia. That's the other problem with the whole situation. So that's the point about F-16s being used. In my opinion, what Ukraine actually needs more is more artillery shells, more high-precision artillery shells, like Excalibur, and MRLS, again, ATACMS or HIMARS, such systems. They need more of them. And there is one more point, and at that war, one plane which actually excelled on both sides, to be honest, was Su-25. It's a ground attacker, and because it's somewhat small and well protected, to be honest, because there were reports from both sides of such plane returning to base after getting shot with manpads, and it still carried the pilot home. So I believe U.S., to be honest, should reconsider also retiring the A-10s, because their A-10 and Su-25 solve the same role. So that's my point. And plus, more rotary wings, more helicopters. Again, helicopters solving the local problems, and they act like a highly mobile anti-tank platform. We're talking about the Russian Vikhr or Ataka systems, or American counterpart is Hellfires. So I believe the support should concentrate on more of this smaller caliber solutions than on something big like F-16. Maybe, in my opinion, they could send more of the, I don't know, let's say even old Cobras would be fine. Something like that. I'm done.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer. Thank you so much for your insights in sharing that with us.
Shablok and then Professor.
Before I get to my main question for Haruf, I just wanted to add a bit of nuance to the discussion about the F-16s, because it really depends how you use them. If normally they go in with Growlers and they do a lot of seed missions and launch a lot of HARM missiles to take out the air defense, right? And once that happens, that can be useful, because then the F-16s can use JDAMs and they can push the air envelope farther out. So that's why they're useful. And keep in mind that Russia is making extensive use of Su-24s and stuff like that, right? And my question was more for Haruf. You know how every military, I guess, has a slightly different culture, and it's more of a sort of a fun question. You know, whether it's the food or the way people interact with each other. You know, whether how they like officers and NCOs interact with each other. What was the most interesting thing that you found in the Ukrainian military that's like slightly culturally different from, let's say, the CAF or something like that? And it's good to hear from your brother.
So obviously now it's war. Something similar that I've seen is how the officers and the NCOs mix up. They mix pretty well with their men. Okay, it's you have pieces of shit everywhere. You would have like commanders that are not deploying, that are not going to visit, or are not taking part in combat operation. But in the first week of the war, I was working alongside a brigade commander that was out there in the field, on the assault with us, coordinating things. Also, is the officer Natalie that I'm talking about in a story that we released last year. When you see us riding on tanks T-72s, you might have seen this video. So during this attack, he was out there. He was taking fucking artillery shots. He got a concussion. He kept going, and he had been in the war since the beginning. So that the officers and the NCOs they mix pretty well with their guys. To the difference where the officers in the Canadian Army was very, from my experience back in the days, they were not really mixing up with us. They were more of that old British style type of thing, where the NCOs would be mixing with us, but not the officers per se.
Would they mess separately, for example?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Well, no, not in the CAF. I'm talking about in the Ukrainian Army.
Oh no! In the battalion and the units we're attached to, officers and NCOs and soldiers were eating in the in the same CAF, in the same cafeteria, in the same room. They had different tables, but they were eating together. The mess hall was not separate.
Okay, thank you for that insight. Merci pour votre service et tout ça vers vos collègues. Godspeed. Bless you.
Well, nice French. Thanks, sir.
Professor.
Oh, I think everybody pretty much cleared up mine, right? As far as clearing the trenches and everything, that's not what the F-16s would do, right? It's pushing that air defense back, pushing back the amount of air assets that Russia can push forward, right? We're seeing a vast increase in their attack helicopters coming up and interdicting and being able to take out armor with proper air assets that reduces their, they don't have air supremacy or even air superiority in the total theater, but at times they do have air superiority that they can push forward those assets to be able to interdict, right? Use of harms and other things, they would push back their air defense and allow our planes to move forward, thus pushing back the amount of things that they can interdict with their assets. And it just kind of takes the pressure off of the forces. So it would help in kind of an ancillary way, but not so in kind of a direct action way.
Crimson?
Yeah, just quickly, I'm going to throw this in the nest. But I just think it's important whenever we talk about these things to listen to what the Ukrainian military is saying, because they've been very clear on the reasons why they want these aircraft. And some of them are not the ones that you immediately think of. For example, the mention of the Soviet aircraft, one of the things they said is, we can use them, but they have to be maintained on an ongoing basis. And the longer that they have to be maintained, right, the supply of spare parts gets less and less. So with some of the planes, they're having to cannibalize, older airframes to provide parts to keep the ones that are in service, and the stocks of parts get lower and lower, and also among the allies, they get less and less. So there are reasons that aren't always the primary one that you think of, and so the Ukrainian military, the Air Force, wrote a great list of all the reasons they want F-16s, and I'm just gonna throw it in the nest because I think they can speak best for themselves.
Great. This is a great discussion. I kind of wanted to move on to this Azov Nazi topic because this is a big one for Russian propaganda. Hey, don't help. We shouldn't be helping the Ukrainians because they're all Nazis. Zelensky is a corrupt Nazi, and they have Nazis in their military, and so that has come up so often, and is still propagated even today. I mean, I kind of shied some of these people. It's like, well, you guys are still hanging on to this. You can at least not. You're not even using the new stuff. That is so 2022. But anyway, so. What I have, and I think I already put this in the nest, so maybe I didn't, but yeah, I'll put it in there now. But so whoever wants to speak to this particular topic can go ahead while I put it in the nest. But basically, the short answer is that there were far right wing elements in this Azov unit, and but. When 2014 happened, a lot of that was reorganized. A lot of those fringe elements were pushed out. Notwithstanding the fact that there are far right wing people in every military. If you have a military of any significant size. But so I'm going to post a post to the nest that kind of deals with this, and it references this article. I'm going to post references a number of other analyses that were done along these lines. If anyone wants to chime in and speak specifically on that topic, just go ahead while I'm doing that.
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, I think there was evidence that there were some there at the leadership level. I think 2014, prior to 2014, there were neo-Nazis. I think some of them were killed, and some of the fighting in the east there. But if you look at the organization now, it's completely restructured and it's been absorbed into the military. One of the things I do, in addition to some OSINT work, is I have a podcast, and I've had relationships in Ukraine for like 10 plus years, maybe 15 years. And one of my friends, or several of my friends, are in the Ukrainian armed forces. In particular, the Ukrainian Special Forces. And we spoke about this on my podcast, and I asked him about the Azov Nazi stuff. And what he said was that he's worked with them on numerous occasions doing, different kind of operations. And he's never, in the whole time that he's worked with them, actually met or seen a Nazi. So what he was saying is he's not sure like where this information comes from because he's not actually seeing it. And even on this space here, I see the Norman Brigade is here, and I mean, they're on the ground in Ukraine. I would imagine he may be able to speak to this. And then I'm also friends with a guy who's a U.S. Marine who went to Ukraine as a journalist, and he interviewed some fighters who fought at the steel plant where there was a big battle, and he interviewed some of the Ukrainian Azov guys who survived the battle, and again, from what he's, the work he's done, he said he didn't see any Nazis. He spoke to the leadership, and they explicitly told him that, there's no Nazis here, and if we ever come across anyone with any Nazi, ideology, we march them right out the front door. So, as far as I can tell, most of that stuff is like old information. Now, there may be some far-right folks, in the Ukrainian military. I think most militaries in the world have them. I would imagine there's probably more Nazis in the Russian military. And we certainly have Nazis in the American military. So I think it's people use sort of old information and just sort of regurgitate that a bit. But there's certainly folks who are in Ukraine who could probably speak to that better than I can.
Yeah, I would say you're right. It's about the same thing. We worked in the same area as Azov when we were in Velika Novoselka for quite a long time. I've met commanders there. I haven't seen any Nazi ideology. They were quite impressed also to see foreigners there. They're like, "What the fuck are you doing, guys?" "Yeah, we're here. We're helping you." And they were like, "Okay." They were very welcoming. It was a moral booster for them, obviously, to see foreigners. There is always and now don't get me wrong, because there's a big difference. Remember, I come from Quebec. So there is always a nationalist notion to it, but nationalist doesn't mean national socialism, doesn't mean they are Nazis or anything. Nationalists are just people who believe in the idea of a nation, of creating a national identity beyond ethnicity and genetic differences in a said country. It has nothing to do with ethno-nationalism as we see, let's say, in Russia. The Ukrainians are very proud where they come from, also probably the Russians also, but there is a big, I would say there's a big culture of superiority when it comes to Russia, where they think they have the right to rule over all the Slavic races because they see themselves as the master race of the Slavic people. And the Ukrainians are not like that at all. They're probably like, "Hey, do you remember Kievan Rus? Okay, are we flexing this shit on you to claim ownership over your fucking swamp over there? No. Okay, so why are you doing this here?" They're pretty much laid back to it. If you look at historical fact and genetic archaeology and all the writings in history, there is absolutely no doubt that Russia is an offspring of the Kievan Rus and not the other way around. So that would set the final tone for their ethno-nationalist rhetoric, especially in Russia, where you have Paul Gubarev and Kiselev, which is the governor of Crimea, who were hardcore Nazis, hardcore, literally like white master race is the Rosyan. And if you look at also the Russian culture, you would have this culture where they distinguish like the Rosyani, which is pretty much the Western Russian central part, I would say, blonde, blue eyes phenotype. And you would have the rest of them when we talk about the minorities, Siberian, Bashkir, and all these people, they would refer to them as Ruski. And anyone coming to you and be like, no, they're talking about the language. No, this is not true. They really distinguish themselves as two classes. You have the ethnic Russians would be the Rosyani, and you would have the rest minorities who are Ruski. And there is a concept of we say in French esclavagisme, so it's basically slavery. It's a serf mentality that has been going on in Russia for quite a long time, and the whole trauma of the Second World War was basically they didn't get to kill people alongside the Nazis because we know that Hitler turned on them. So this is their great trauma. But also, after the victory, they saw themselves as highly superior because they had achieved, per se, some victory over what the Germans were considering themselves as very highly advanced and mostly the master race, etc., etc. So when they beat the German, obviously they saw themselves as greater than these people who were first allied with them, but who turned on them, and natural selection did the work. Obviously, with the help of the United States and all the equipment we gave them. So,
Thank you for that, and I will note for the record, for those they sort of alluded to this in passing, that those Azov guys, they bought time for the other parts of Ukraine with their lives, essentially by holding out at that steel plant, and they're going to be the names of those guys at Azov is going to be ringing out for decades after this, talking about what those soldiers did, because they, in tying down those Russian forces in that area, like I said, they bought time for other parts of Ukraine, and they did a great job. So that I think will be something that will be talked about for a long time in Ukraine and elsewhere, when the book of this war is written. One more thing from Crimson before we dispatch with this Azov Nazi nonsense.
Yeah. Just to wrap it up, I wanted to say, I think that the over focus on this on the Ukrainian side is also something that directly to Russia as they were attempting to invade further into Ukraine. So because of this, it's not just the history, but it's also the balance of coverage, and you see the effects of Russian propaganda everywhere. For example, it's just not really talked about very often that the Wagner Group is named after Richard Wagner, which is Hitler's favorite composer, right? You would think that with the focus to the extent on things in Ukraine, that every time Wagner Group is mentioned, that the people who are concerned about the far right and about fascist groups and tendencies would bring this up. But in all the mentions of Wagner over the last month and previous months, it's very rarely discussed. Nor the fact that there are actual sort of concentration camps now in occupied territory in Ukraine. So just to wrap this up, this is a narrative that's been intentionally pushed to try to disparage the people of Ukraine and the soldiers of Ukraine. But once you start digging into how things look on the Russian side, it's pretty plainly obvious that they're not even following along with their own complaints about this sort of thing, because it's far more prevalent on their side.
Shimamoto, quickly on this before we move on to the next topic.
Yeah, just pretty easy. To be honest, I never actually thought about like division on Россияне и русские. It just never came to my mind. Maybe I'm different, right? But it is fact that neo-Nazi ideology is very popular in Russia, and I know that because even in school there were like skinheads, this type of people, right? And was super popular at that time, and I was the nerd type, so I was always away from that. But that's for sure. But also, just to add to that, like, were Nazis in Azov? Maybe, but like as correctly said before, what army doesn't have them? Because the ideology which Nazi built in of the army, of the prestige of army, is basically explaining warrior just in different ways. So, I mean, nothing unusual there, to be honest to me. So, yeah, that's it.
Oh, can I add something also? Is it possible, Brian?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Also, there is something that I've noticed. So I've quite a little bit of studies in genetic archaeology and history, et cetera, and you come across artifacts sometimes in Ukraine where you would have like it's not a single swastika, but it's more like multiple swastika altogether, and
Kalavrat,
something like that. Yeah, and that refers to the old archaeology. The old cultures of the Indo-Europeans and the steppe cultures of it's a millennial millennial symbol. And we have to remember that the Germans, when they wanted to create the myth of the superior race and everything, like they knew their archaeology, they knew their history in general, but they didn't really have much data to prove where these symbols and the admixture that they tried to claim as theirs was coming from. And
Right? They
to me,
sent
it's kind of
to Tibet. They sent the Ananarbe to
Oh, it's more
Tibet.
than that. It's more than that because obviously the Indo-European cultures. This is what we're saying. Like the Proto-Indo-Europeans, you have Indo and Europeans. So all the people that was living between, I would say, what is modern day Austria and then India. This is where the Indo-European culture came from. So you had all these symbols, and obviously the Germans appropriated these symbols. So sometimes you travel in Ukraine and you come across artifacts where you see, you know, this intrinsic, like very refined, I would say, arts and archaeological artifacts, etc., etc. And it's sad that it has been hijacked by the Germans because it has a very rich history and has been corrupted. And sometimes you would come across old settlements with artifacts, and you would have that on these artifacts, and it's like 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years old. And the, I would say, this history and the value of those artifacts are negated by this fucking Nazi bullshit who decided to use these symbols. So it's part also of the Russian propaganda. They have no problem in using, I would say, these things, these symbols, you know, for their units. For the, you know, they have chevron, like patches for their units. You look at the Rusich, for example, or Aerorozvedka. It's like air reconnaissance for other also units where the Russians would use these symbols and be like, oh, this is old Slavic meaning, old Slavic symbols. But soon as you would see something similar, I would say, to a former hooligan or a person who knows history, they would point that right away as fucking Nazis and look at that, you know, they get tattoos, when in fact it's something millennial that goes beyond 3,000-4,000 years old. So it's a little bit confusing when you're not really aware of the historical data of what it was and how it is used now.
May I add a little bit to you, Norman? If you don't mind.
Just a second. We've got some breaking news, I understand, Professor.
So CNN ran an article like less than an hour ago that according to non-public source, Biden administration strongly leaning towards providing Ukraine with cluster munitions coming shortly.
So you wanted some trench clearance shit? Here we go, you have it.
So, Norman, what, ironically, the Kolovrat symbol...
I get excited, but hate it at the same time because I do understand that, you know, Ukrainians still have to live there after the fact, and they're going to be cleaning up that garbage for the next 40 years.
Gotcha. Okay, Sumamoto, go ahead.
Yeah, ironically, Kolovrat is banned in Russia. Like, it's illegal to wear the symbol and to show it, but there is a saying in Russian, and probably Ukrainian people, if they're listening, they will translate it for me because I don't know the proper translation to English. And it says, "Закон, что дышло, куда дунул, туда вышло." Basically, closer translation would be the law. You can basically form the law as you want, right? And that's kind of used in Russia a lot. You can say, look at the Prigozhin, for example, right? Destroying like 4 airframes and just getting out of the country freely, that type of stuff. But yeah, the Kolovrat, what you're referring to, is old Slavic symbol. It's the pre-Christianity gods, referring to them like Perun and all this things. And it's very popular culture in Russia, by the way. I'm saying that as from my perspective. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. And by the way, you mentioned Rusich. Guys, for everyone to know, these are fucking Nazis, like real Nazis. They do believe in the superiority of Russian race. I know that, and this is, to me, it's cringy. But yeah, I'm done.
I mean, the founder of Roosters came out and said directly on camera to everyone's face, "I am a Nazi." So yeah, if the press is looking for a place to start there.
I'm not sure if it's Bloke or Kay first.
I was up first, and I just wanted to make a very quick point. As we're talking about, Nazis in Ukraine, and one of Putin's stated goals of denazification of Ukraine, when, Azov, the guys came out of the steel plant and taken prisoners by Russia. Russia traded the top Azov guys. They have to stay in Turkey till the end of the war, but all the top leadership of Azov were released by Russia, who they claimed, they were going to put on trial and this and that, and they traded them for all their rhetoric of that. And yeah, it's sort of like, when what Russia says about other people is basically just what they're saying about themselves. But that's rather ironic that for all that talk about denazification and what they claim about Azov, and they release the top.
Look,
I just wanted to add a bit of nuance around cluster munitions, because first of all, the cluster, Russia has been using them, and the Russian cluster munitions will stay. And a lot of the you might get a few duds with the Western cluster munitions, but they will. They're designed to self-destruct after a certain amount of time. So I just wanted to point that out, depending on the ones you're using. So they're necessary. They're probably the best thing to deal with, massed infantry attacks or clearing trenches, as Hruf was saying. So just wanted to add that.
Okay, Aaron, and then we'll go on to the next topic.
Thank you. Just in regards to the Nazis, Australia SAS, there's photos of them with literal Nazi flags and Confederate flags. There's quite a few war crimes investigations going on in regards to them. So what you find is that there are Nazis everywhere, but if you've got a strong liberal democracy, is they just such a minority, they get no traction. And that was obviously seen with the political parties, the far-right political parties in Ukraine. When it came to the general populace, there was just no acceptance of that. Although there may be some love for strong nationalism that then bleeds into Nazism, the actual Nazi party's got no traction. So, yeah, just to state that we have the problem here, but they're such a minority, they don't get any control. And that's sort of what I think we've seen in Ukraine, is that there's a minority, but they don't have much political clout when it comes to free and fair elections. Thanks.
Great. So I want to squash. We won't spend a lot of time on this because it's
I just wanted
essentially.
to say something quickly. Norman,
Yeah.
if you're listening, your DMs are closed, so I can't message you. If you don't mind, would you be able to send me a quick DM?
Okay. So I just want to quickly squash this bug called biolabs. So Professor, Tucker Carlson promised me that that one of the big reasons why this war happened is because Putin felt he had no other choice because he was afraid of biological weapons attack due to the presence of biolabs that were in Ukraine. And the U.S. was directly involved in sort of, I guess, in nefarious activities. This is the way the story, I guess, goes, and was developing bioweapons potentially that would be used offensively either in Crimea or just as a preemptive attack against Russia. So just slice and dice that argument for me like you did that other toady that tried to push that narrative.
So this is an often changing argument. Like if there's ever been a moving goalpost, the Ukrainian biolab should be in the dictionary next to it, because you never know what you're going to get, right? They may start off with, oh, it's bioweapons labs. And then when you squash that, it turns into, but the biolabs. And like, so the issue is like we have the Defense Threat Reduction Program, and the Soviet Union was literally a founding partner member and like the first person that benefited from this. From 1996 to 2013, we gave Russia, not Ukraine, $1.5 billion to help with biological, radiological, nuclear weapons, etc. And prior to 2014, those Russian scientists worked hand in hand in the Ukrainian biolabs that Russia is complaining about. They didn't have any problems with it until they just started trying to conquer Ukraine. And then when you have to manufacture a pretext, you are going to. Most of the stuff that you say as supporting evidence, when you actually look into it and say, hey, I want more information on this, you click on the whatever quote and you go and look at it, and it's often some Russian propagandist that's making stuff up. So you go and do further research on whatever the Russian propagandist does, and you discover that it came from a soldier in the Donbass in 2014 or 2015, and there's no supporting evidence whatsoever. It's basically one person that woke up and go, oh yeah, this happened. And it just falls apart on its face. But I mean, like, you can go and look. Russia actually came and asked specifically for funds to go and help, like, decontaminate and get rid of agents at their vector laboratories. So 400 scientists spent more than $100 million of DTR funds for the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, which was Vector, State Research Center for Applied Microbiology, Obelisc, Russian Research Institute for Phytopathology, Biologics Plant, Russian Scientific Research for Veterinary Institute. All of these people received the same funding that Ukrainian had. So, like, to say, oh, well, we're so concerned about Ukraine, these were not even like remotely close to facilities that you would perform that specific type of research in, right? The biological labs generally have 4 safety levels: BSL 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each one of them has, it has to be surrounded by a gated fence. You have to have armed security, and when you get down to it, like, the actual research facility has to be in a positive pressurized room. In addition, if you're going to work with samples, they have to be in a vented hood. You have to work in the orange suit, right? We've all seen movies, Contagion, etc. That's the BSL-4 labs. And there's different classifications for each type of the agents that you're going to work with, right? So one of the things, like, when Ukraine was invaded, WHO sent out and the DTR said, hey, destroy all your dangerous biological samples. Well, Russia latched onto this and be like, see, they're destroying the weapons, which, according to WHO, anything that is the flu or higher is a dangerous biological agent. So they were basically saying, if you have flu samples or anything above, destroy it. So because, as we can watch from the Russian soldiers in Chernobyl, you don't want a bunch of untrained morons walking around with biological agents, even if it is the flu. Because if this got out, it could create a problem. Not that it is a weapon, but if literally some moron managed to cut himself on a flu sample, he could literally kill 200,000 or 300,000 people. We know the flu in the early 1900s killed, what, 40 million people? Like, the flu itself is bad. So, like, again, anytime that you see nonsense like this, like, if you actually go in and do the barest amount of research, their whole argument entirely falls apart. And, you can actually, but they're top secret. There's actually documentation on the internet that goes back to 2005 that specifically talks about these laboratories. So when they say they're top secret, they'd be like, they're top secret from who? Any moron not on the internet? Is literally how it comes out. So
Excellent. Sumamoto.
Yeah, but you're missing the key point that the Russian Ministry of Nature, Minpriroды, it's called like that, said, quote unquote, migrating birds can be used not just in economical means, aka as the bioweapon. So they're claiming that Ukraine is using birds, mosquitoes, crickets as a bioweapon. I'm not kidding. Everything I say right now is from official sources, both Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Ecology of Russia. So, first question I have, do they have a shitty cocaine so they go so hard on that, right? It's like the first question I have. And the second question is actually, do they really understand that using... Okay, so I'm going to go through several points. First point, they're saying that they create like the... basically, United States created a weapon which attacks specific genome of a human, and they want to kill all Russians. That's like pure propaganda, because if such weapon would exist, I mean, the half of United States would die too, and the whole Europe, and the whole Russia, and Ukraine too, and doesn't matter. Like the population of basically the Caucasus race itself, right? The Caucasian race itself will just die. Yeah, great job. Like 10 over 10. Good job, guys. Second point about mosquitoes. I know for a fact that United States experimented with cats and for usage in intelligence, and usage of animals in army is nothing new. Like the military dogs, the K9 units is just a simple example of that. But Russia itself is using dolphins, for example, which actually a really questionable idea, or something like that. But mosquitoes, seriously, mosquitoes don't care who to buy; they just want to buy. That's all. And in reality, if such mosquito weapon would exist, it would create much more problems than it would solve any. So yeah, that's just breaking on the points which Russian government makes. And the only question is, we solved every one except of one. What kind of crack they're smoking? That's all.
Well, it's good stuff. To follow up, you did forget about the new addition to the Ukrainian Navy, which was the trained sharks.
Oh yeah. That's it in Turkey, right?
Egypt, I think. Yeah, that was Egypt.
Oh, Egypt. I'm sorry. You know, I think someone really liked the movie Jaws, if he said that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so the last topic I had, because I know we're running up on 8 o'clock, is the military aid. So, what exactly is the situation with Western aid, not just from the United States, but from all over the country? Of course, the domestic people are making political and this propaganda space I was in this morning that was talked about, and even my own congressman, while he supports Ukraine, has expressed concerns about tracking this stuff, making sure it doesn't fall in the wrong hands, and also being a good steward of U.S. taxpayers' money. So what I've done is I put in the nest, and actually I'm thanking Aaron Boma on this. So he actually found this. He retweeted this from some other person who is keeping a running list of all of the military aid sent to Ukraine by the United States, either from existing stocks, Presidential Drawdown Authority, or an ordered new from industry. So I submit that for your review. And I'm glad Wolverine's here also because we can kind of dive into this some. I've also put in the nest, releases from the news releases from the aid package that was recently released, announced for Ukraine by the United States, by the Biden administration. There's a bullet point list, and there's the actual press release there. And, and we talk about this a lot in the Bauma report whenever these releases come out. But for those who don't go into that space and you maybe run into this into the wild, out in the wild, that people are saying, I had even that Jackson Hinkle Russian fanboy who lives in California, actually, that's kind of ironic, basically said that we had sent $200 billion of military aid to Ukraine. And that's just not factually correct. And I think what's happening is that people are looking at, and even people who just ordinary people that kind of see this on CNN or on Faux News or on any sort of other website and say, oh well, or it's forwarded on by a pundit that says, oh, we're just announcing we're sending another $500 million to Ukraine, and the imagery that is left with the person who's not understanding the details is that we're loading up pallets of cash onto a C-5 or C-17 and flying it across the Atlantic Ocean, opening up the door over Ukraine and letting the cash fly out the back door, and we're making it rain. It's like we're at the strip club, and we're raining $100 and $100. If someone else has some more specific detail on that, but it's essentially the value of this as opposed to dollar amounts. So when you look at the actual press release, the vast majority of stuff you see here is specifically Colby. I'm glad you're coming up here because I had a feeling that you would be able to shed some more light on this. Help us all understand when we start talking about these dollar amounts that get thrown around in these releases. Put some context to it, Colby.
Hey, sorry, can you hear me? I'm in the car right now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. So you may recall there was the recent announcement where the Pentagon said they had determined that they had been overvaluing the equipment that was sent to Ukraine by a figure of 6.3 billion, I believe it was.
I did see that.
Yeah. So, and again, I mean, this, to your point, Brian, about the level of discourse, and the media is largely responsible for this. The way that they just talk about things, they're not very precise in the way that they explain things to the public. It led a lot of people to believe like, oh, they lost $6.3 billion. Well, no, they didn't lose $6.3 billion. It's a question of how they were evaluating the equipment that is provided. So what they were doing is that they were valuing the equipment at the replacement cost, but that's not what they're supposed to do. Existing policy requires them to value it at the depreciated value of the asset being transferred. So you buy a piece of equipment however many years ago, its value today is less than what it was when you bought it. That's the valuation that they're supposed to use in the calculations of the value of everything that gets sent in the package. So they were using the wrong way of calculating value beforehand. Now they're doing it correctly, and because of that discrepancy, there's an additional $6.3 billion worth of equipment that can be sent because they've revalued everything that's been provided to date, and that's the difference. And going forward, things will be provided using that correct definition, which is the depreciated value of the asset that's being provided.
That's very helpful, Colby. Thank you. And Wolverine, you and I have had a similar conversation about this because if you look at that list, which that exhaustive list that has the cumulative bullet point listing, the call out of stuff that's been sent. A lot of this stuff has actually been in storage in the United States or elsewhere for 5, 10, 20, and I think to the point, your point that you made me opened my eyes a few weeks ago where you said some of this stuff is 50 years old.
Yeah, some of it can. I mean, it all depends. Like ammunition is a one thing, and I'm actually looking for. I don't know. I guess this is the total. Oh yeah. So, whoops. What the heck?
Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button.
I'm trying to find the. Okay. So I'm just like right now, the new 8 package. Okay. So, additional munitions for Patriot. Obviously, they need them. They're using them, but with a high expenditure rate. I don't know when all companies produce it, so that's something they're going to have to worry about. Same with Stinger missiles because they just got they're basically getting the production lines back up and producing them because they had them for a while. Let's see. Ammunition for HIMARS, MLRSs, obviously. Demolition munitions and systems, and mine clearing equipment. Now, that could be a whole gamble of stuff, from anything from our MICLEX, which we currently run 3 different types in the United States, to vehicles that can be used for breaching operations and stuff like that. So that actually covers a whole wide area. And sometimes when you think about like the mine clearing equipment, you got to wonder what kind of mine clearing equipment are they giving? Are they giving, like, we have these one flail things or M9 Aces or other equipment like that. So that's the thing you have to worry about too. The Ukrainians still haven't learned combined arms like how we have in the U.S., and because of that, they go through an astonishing amount of ammunition. We have a lot more. We have better target acquisition and actually engaging those targets with our stuff. The Bradleys is not a big issue. We got something like 2,000 Bradleys in storage, and that's not going to be that big of an issue. Reason being is because as long as they don't go like stupid ridiculous with how many they give, because the Army is getting the new vehicle, the OMFP, which is not the M10. I forgot. Anyways, they have a new a replacement vehicle. Right now it's between Rheinmetall and General Dynamics. So they are going to eventually be getting new vehicles to replace all the Bradleys. The Strykers, same thing. The Strykers, I'm assuming that they're getting, or the first generation, which are the non-double V hull. And we actually have 2 versions, the double V hull plus, I believe it is. And the double V hull ones, I do not see the U.S. giving those up. But the regular Bradleys, regular Strykers, I see that because the U.S. actually not deactivated, but they changed out a couple brigades that had Strykers and made them into infantry units. So there's a lot of excess Strykers in that. All the other munitions, is just going to be, the only thing that's going to be that is how much are we willing to draw down, because we have to keep our certain requirements for the U.S. military to conduct the combat operations.
Correct.
One I did see that is the testing diagnostic equipment. That's actually a big one, because what people don't realize, yeah, people don't realize this. Like, it's not like the old days where we had 5 tons of deuce and halves and you could fix them with like literally like duct tape and baling wire. The newer vehicles have to have laptops and computers and other stuff like that to do certain types of troubleshooting on those. You can't just hook up to I'm just let's say like a HIMARS or MLRS. You just can't go up to and troubleshoot everything because some of the stuff you can't even access because of all the armor. So you use the laptops, you hook up to a certain port, and then you can do certain troubleshooting, diagnostics, and stuff like that. So, and the good thing is once they learn that troubleshooting, at least with the U.S. vehicles, the way we do it with our troubleshooting is pretty much the same across all the different vehicles and how we do it. So once they learn the system and they see how things work, those things that actually right there will be huge for them and allow them to do, just keep their vehicles up and keep them going along with doing what they need to do. But like I said,
Gotcha.
ammunition is going to be the big one, depending on what our stocks are and what they're trying to produce and or buy. Like example, they're talking about trying to buy 155 ammunition from South Korea. I don't know if they've done it or not yet, and to send it over to Ukraine. If they do that, then that doesn't put as much of a strain on us, but that's things that they're going to have to worry about eventually.
Yeah, and I heard that 155 plant's running 3 shifts here in the U.S. That one in the southeast U.S. Or is it Ohio? I'm trying to remember where it was. I don't remember where it was. That I saw the news article. Crimson.
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly speak to the other side of this issue, which is the sort of propaganda of like, oh, where is this equipment going? We don't know what's happening to it. What are they doing? So I just wanted to say it's pretty clear that on both sides, especially when it relates to the U.S., both the U.S. and Ukrainian side have a vested interest in making sure that they know exactly where things are going and what is where. So this equipment doesn't just, get shipped over there. There are serial numbers, there are barcodes. They've been provided with software and scanners and things like that so that it's clear once these things arrive where they're being offloaded and where they're going. In addition to that, at the Defense Department, the Inspector General has done, there's quite an effort for oversight, right? So it's not that these things just get left there and that's it. There are multiple ongoing sort of investigations from the DoD Office of the Inspector General just to continually monitor these things and make sure that there's oversight in how all of the equipment is being used. And there are more than 90 people that were hired, or not hired, but have been tasked with just this, just strictly oversight of things that are being sent to Ukraine. And in addition to that, on the Ukrainian side, right, like we said before, Ukraine needs a lot more equipment than they currently have. And so that means that every piece of it that's there is valued. And so when you're in a situation where you're defending yourself against an invasion from a country like Russia, you can't afford to be selling stuff off to different places there. Everything needs to be used on the battlefield. And so even on the Ukrainian side, right, they've made an effort to integrate NATO's logistics tracking and management system, LogFOS, with the system that they were using on the Ukrainian side. And they've hired a number of people specifically just for that purpose, just to manage integration of their logistics systems with NATO's logistics management system. So I just wanted to say on both sides, this is not a situation where stuff just gets shoveled over there and we don't know what's happening to it. It's both in the Ukrainian interest and in the U.S. interest to make sure that every single piece of it.
Yeah, you kind of cut out at the end there. Mic check. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yes, 100%.
Okay. So yeah, and the funniest thing I saw on this topic was somebody found they had a picture from the cartels, if I remember correctly, and somebody somebody took a picture and said, "Oh, this must have been from Ukraine," and Ukraine sold. I forget what the equipment was. They sold these to. It was maybe man pads, or it was something that was sold to supposedly to the cartels in Mexico, and they tried to say, yeah, see, the Ukrainians are not taking care of the gear and not keeping track of it, and they're just selling. They're corrupt, and they're selling it for cash. And so I want to. I can't take credit for it. I think it was actually Intel that actually came up with this analogy when it came up. It was like, yeah, that would be like the Allies at Dunkirk as the Nazis are bearing down on them, as they're about to be fighting to stop being, to not have to be evacuated across the English Channel, turning around and said, "Hey, we're trying to avoid being exterminated and killed here. Let's just take some of these weapons that we're depending on for our lives, and let's go make a little money and sell them to some Mexicans." So yeah, that just it's humorous on its face, and it turned out that it wasn't even something that necessarily would have come from Ukraine. Just it wasn't. If there was incompatibility, if I remember correctly. Suamoto.
Actually, I want to correct you on that. I saw that picture, and I believe it wasn't even the. It wasn't even the combat ready version. It was actually training.
Yeah.
Stinger, because
AP4 training.
AT4 training, because I believe the training one has the line, additional line, right? The white one, or am I incorrect?
Pretty sure it's yellow.
Oh yeah. So it wasn't like it was inert basically. So it's just like another piece of propaganda, I guess. Nothing really serious. This is one thing, and second thing, I heard, and the actually valid concern, that Ukraine reported that a lot of equipment they get actually in not so good condition. So they do say that a lot of equipment they got wasn't not even combat ready, and some of that wasn't in pristine condition. They had to do a lot of work on it, and they had to send it back to, I believe, some Italian stuff. They had to send it back to Italy so they can do some repair job on the equipment they get. Leads me to question, right? Do these people not really understand how bad the situation is, or just trying to make quick buck out of the whole story?
Yeah, I've got Intel trying to come up to become a speaker. So if you don't have anything in particular to say at the moment, if you could rotate down, I promise to bring you back up as needed. But I'd like to get Intel up here.
You can take me off. I will probably shut off for some time.
You can drop me.
All right, where did Intel go? Did he leave? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just rotate, and let me try to get Intel back.
Well,
All right.
While you're doing that, I was going to speak to what he was saying about some of the equipment, and the equipment that a lot of the equipment they were talking about is actually pre-staged equipment that the Army had over in Kuwait. They basically are supposed to have a pre-positioned brigade's worth of equipment over there for operations, which they do. But I tell you what, I was over there for a year, and I had to deal with some of the civilians who were on those contracts. And some of those dudes, I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. Like, I had a wrecker that was, and there was two main camps. So we have Camp Arifjan and Camp, oh crap, I forgot mine. Oh, Camp Buring. I was at Camp Buring. It's more than northern Kuwait. And we had a bunch of equipment, that I was getting repaired down in Arifjan, because what happened is the unit that we replaced was at Arifjan, but we got moved up to Buring, so we had some stuff down there. So I had a wrecker that I really needed. And it's like every time I check with them, hey, how's the wrecker? Oh, we did this, but now this doesn't work. or this leaks, or they did, or like, hey, I got this. It's like, no, it's not working. I'm like, what in the hell? So what happened is, and the guy who's like the overall charge guy for maintenance for all the units in Kuwait was not happy about what I did. But what I did is, because we have what we call FMSs, I forgot what it stands for, and we have FMS A and FMS B, and I had FMS B where I was at. So I got a letter, got it written up by my company commander, took it down to Arab John, and said, I am taking my fucking truck back because you dudes are fucking around with it and I need my shit. I took it up to FMSB, took it into them. They did the work on it, and I had the truck back within a week and a half to 2 weeks, and they fixed everything, right? And that's how they were. Those guys are like, because the thing is the more equipment that's in maintenance, the more money they get from the U.S. Army. So I can see that, they're like, oh yeah, this is a good Humvee. You get it, and it's for fucking shit. That does not surprise me at all that if they were getting the equipment out of Arifjan, that some of that equipment was actually like that. Now, the other thing he was talking about was the munitions, okay? It's war. It's combat. Stuff is going to end up missing. Trust me. I know. I used to have to do recovery, and I saw some shit left on the sides of the road the Marines should not have left, like a whole truck with a tandem trailer filled with like 200 rounds. I don't know how many. It was a lot of 155 artillery just sitting there, abandoned, and no one guarding it, And the Iraqis had guns that could use those rounds. So in war, you are going to have stuff. When the vehicle gets destroyed, they may not have a chance to recover everything. And some of those munitions can sometimes end up in the hands of people who are going to try and sell them to the highest bidder. And no matter what you do and stuff like that, it just happens sometimes that it just happens. It's like we had to worry about stingers from Afghanistan still because we gave them all those stingers back in the 70s to use against the Russians. So it does happen. And like I said, if I saw a Javelin pop up for sale for somewhere in the world and like, oh yeah, this is one we gave to Ukraine. Okay, well, I could understand it if it was like one or two, because sometimes they just don't have the time to recover everything off a vehicle that is damaged because of whatever circumstances, or the whole vehicle might just get left there. So, if it does pop up, hey, literally shit happens, and all you can do is hope for the best.
Thank you for that, Strategic Jane.
Yes, thank you. Hey, I want to ask Wolverine a question. You're saying that some of this equipment, and would be not a surprise to me, is coming out of Pompkus pre-positioned stuff. I mean, basically pre-packaged hardware that we're leaving at different places. I mean, I know that's something we do, but I didn't know that we're just giving them Pompkus hardware.
My understanding from the story I read is I believe so, because right now if you go to Kuwait, they have two sets of gear. They have the pre-pro gear, and then they have the TPE gear. The TPE gear, a lot of that is allocated to the units doing whatever missions that they got over there. But the pre-pro gear is like in a whole different area and stored separately from where everything else is. So the article I saw, I would assume that it would be that gear that was in the pre-pro. I think that's what I saw for the story. I'm gonna have to double check. I need to find that story and double check for sure. But a lot of that TPE gear is literally like no shit left over from Iraq when we were there in 03 to whenever. The pre-pro gear, they get a lot more newer stuff rotated in because they have to keep up with everything. So I would see it. I don't know. It could be TPE, it could be pre-pro, but without seeing it, I would just say it's probably pre-pro.
let me ask you a follow up to that. Of everything that is going um, into into the Ukrainians right now, it seems like they're, at least to me, it's got to be really tough for them to sort of fuse everything together to, create. I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of like, these guys, 155 shells, and another country is sending other stuff. We're sending F-16s. I mean, old F-16s that are going to need to be overhauled and really worked on, re-engined. I mean, they're going to have to be completely stripped out, and at least my understanding is they're going to have to be worked on from square one, and it won't take a long time. It's just a matter of, I'm beginning to think that, God, these guys are getting equipment from several countries, and most of them are NATO countries, so there's gonna be some consistency. But I'm wondering if the inconsistency in the age of equipment and the types of equipment they're getting are going to cause any warfighting problems for the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I don't see that happening because everything is pretty much decentralized. Air Force is Air Force. They're gonna deal with the problem. Artillery is artillery. Engineers will deal with the problem when it comes to maintenance, etc., etc. So everybody has a job to do. They are focused on what they have to do. They learn, and it's not a problem. I definitely don't see any of that being a problem.
Okay.
So one thing I was going to say is Crimson actually.
Somebody needs to mute their mic. Now, who it is? What were you going to say, Wolverine?
So Crimson was kind enough to actually show me the article. So it was actually the article I had seen and was looking for. And it said specifically that the equipment that had the issues was drawn from the Army APS stocks. So that right there tells you if that was gear meant for ARB guys to want to combat and the gear is that jacked up, that's not good. And because that story is so high profile that I wouldn't be surprised if they'd look into it more and find out what those people who are doing that, because most of that work is actually done by the civilian contractor. So if it is done by a civilian contractor and they're just fudging the paperwork, which wouldn't surprise me because they get the more shit they work on, the more money they get, and it affects the readiness, especially if for some reason a whole Army brigade did have to get flown into Kuwait for whatever reason and get in on that gear. That gear is meant to be, hey, I get in, I drive off, and that's it. Now, as far as aircraft, the Air Force does have some different standards for how they maintain their aircraft and storage and stuff like that. But the good thing is most of the F-16s, the countries that are willing to donate them, I think have already started actually pulling them out and actually started going through them and doing any repairs on them that may need to be done. Was it Denmark or Sweden? I don't know where it was. So I don't think the aircraft situation would be, because it's not like a truck. Oh, the truck does drive because it's got a flat tire, compared to an F-16 is, oh, it won't lock onto a target because of this component, and they have to replace it. So the quality of work, between aircraft and ground vehicles is a lot different than what many people would think.
Can I add one thing on that topic?
Yeah, go ahead, Colby.
Thanks. So per regulation, any equipment that's provided by the United States through Presidential Drawdown Authority is supposed to be in working condition. There's a specific classification system which they use. Wolverine might know. I don't recall off the top of my head. I don't have the documents I need in front of me since I'm in the car, not in front of my computer. But basically, it's supposed to be in working condition, operable condition. So if anything does get sent that is not in operable condition, somebody should absolutely be getting fired for that, because that is a big violation of DoD regulation. So they're not supposed to be sending junk over there that doesn't work. That's not supposed to happen. It very well may happen. And obviously, in cases where they're providing ammunition that might be really old, maybe it doesn't work, maybe it's dud. There's always going to be dud rates. But as far as like actual equipment, it's not supposed to be like not in functioning condition. Nothing to that standard is supposed to be sent over.
So like for the Marine Army side, we use condition codes, and ours go from A down to I think H, which is like total shit. But some of the condition codes you got to read, because, like example, let's say you have like condition code E, that mean that the vehicle is fully functional. It just doesn't have any of the newest modifications done to it. But otherwise, the vehicle is fully functional and operational. So typically, like condition code A is the best gear. It's got all the modifications and stuff like that. And they actually, like on our vehicles, the Army vehicles, on the Marine Corps and Army vehicles, they actually will paint on there, and it'll say like, it'll say CC and then a space and then an A, and it'll have some like a preservation date or CARC date. But that condition code tells you what shape of the vehicle it is in, and because even if it's condition date code A, they actually still have to go through every so often and do the annual checks and services on it to make sure that that piece of equipment is ready for operational use.
Okay, you're coming in a little scratchy there, Wolverine, but we got that. Irish. Irish, you have the mic.
Yeah, I was struggling to unmute. Yeah, I was reading the other week that like Ukraine have 600 600 T-64s that Poland and Czechoslovakia are going to upgrade. Like, could they do work on, like, I suppose their whole fleet maintenance will end up in Poland, I guess, will it?
So on that one, the only thing I know is that, so the issue with the T-64 is this. The T-64 was only built in Ukraine for Ukraine and Russia. And when they split, the T-64 was never exported to any other country until Ukraine sold some of them off when they were separated. Now, as far as parts and stocks and stuff like that, I can't see them doing any work on T-64s, but I can see them doing work on T-72s, because they, the Polish had the PT-91 the Czechs had some other variations of it and stuff like that. So they still have a lot of the knowledge base, the parts, the supplies and stuff like that to do T-72s easily. A lot of those T-64 parts, if they are going to do that, would probably have to be sourced from Ukraine itself.
Colby.
Yeah, so Poland and Czechia did offer to provide repair services for Ukrainian vehicles. Romania might have been in that group as well. I forget. I think Romania too offered to do that. But to Wolverine's point, I think it's very unlikely that the T-64 would be one of those vehicles for the reasons outlined, that it was never exported to any of the Warsaw Pact. So they have no technical expertise with that vehicle. They don't have any ability to source any of the parts that they need. The T-72, on the other hand, is a very obvious candidate because those countries, have very robust domestic industries that continue to produce upgraded T-72s, both for their own militaries or were for their own militaries, but for foreign customers as well. So they had the capacity to not only repair damaged vehicles or refurbish vehicles coming out of deep storage, they have the capacity to upgrade them to a more modernized standard. And that's already been happening with vehicles that were coming out of their own inventory. So certainly T-72s can go to Poland, they can go to Czechia, they can go to other places, they can get refurbished, they can even get upgraded potentially. T-64s, not so much.
Intel, I'm glad that you're here, and I know you probably had some. I apologize, I couldn't bring you up earlier. Didn't have the slots, but that was on me because I need to add some co-hosts to get some more slots. Um Wanted to ask you about because you talk about tracking. We were talking about tracking and everything's being tracked, and you had an observation that stuff is also reported to Congress. Isn't there like Congressional Research Service, something like that? That someone can, that's actually in the public domain, if I remember correctly, the reporting back to Congress, the auditing on equipment that's sent to Ukraine?
Yeah, so DOD has, in terms of like the grand list of everything, so every time you see in the news, DOD announces, $500 million aid package or whatever, right? At the bottom of every single announcement, you'll see a PDF link on the DOD website. They'll say like Ukraine fact sheet or something like that. And it gets updated each time there's a new update for aid announced. And that's just a tracker of all equipment sent to date. Congressional Research Service has their own thing that they put out pretty frequently, so the CRS. Then I'm sure there's reports, congressional committee reports whenever they talk about it in their subcommittee hearings and stuff.
Before we go to Wolverine, I did want to. We were in the Bauma report, and this topic came up, and somebody said that I think somebody that was actually either in country or worked with people in country, and he said that even within Ukraine, like the Ukrainians themselves have this lockdown. Like if you're issued a weapon and you're going across, and you have to account for the weapons, or if you lose your weapon, you have to that has to be documented. Herlif, does this square with what you're seeing out there? But the story that we got is that there is a lot of effort being done by Ukraine to track this stuff.
100%. Even since last summer, they sent us some javelins through one of the unit that was out there. So it was signed up to their book, but we were using it because most of them didn't know how to use it. And I remember they asked us to conduct some training directly at the front. We're getting shelled. We're in some administrative building, and I was running classes for Javelin. And I remember asking them if it was possible to have a training unit that we could set up, in a little bit in the rear. They said, no, there's probably only 2 units out there. And I said, okay, can we have access to more units so we can shoot with it for real, instead of just trying to show them on the fly and hoping they don't die with this. So they said no, because everything is accounted for. It's like every shot that you take with any fucking launchers or tubes, we have to declare it as, was it used in combat, was it broken, was it lost? That was already logged on since, I would say, end of May 2022.
Thank you for that. Wolverine.
So one thing I just want to kind of go over, and it goes along with the T-64s. The T-64 is not the only tank that no one else can really work on. The T-80 is another one. The T-80 was exported a little bit more than the T-64, but it's like, like when you look at the T-72, the T-90, right? T-72 and the T-90 is basically like a big modification of the T-72, but it's basically the same vehicle. And same thing kind of goes for the T-64 and the T-80. A lot of the running gears and components are between those ones as well, are actually also specific to those vehicles. Now, the T-80 has been exported a little bit more, obviously, than the T-64. But when you go to like Poland and all them, they may not have them. So the vehicles I could see them actually working on would be, anything based on the T-62 variants, probably MTLBs, because those are everywhere, BMP-1, BMP-2s, ZSU-23-4s, and some of the equipment like that. But I would think that maybe like the T64, T64, T80, Pantier S1s, unless they were exported, might be an issue. And I think that's really the biggest ones. You might have some like rocket systems or air defense units, but a lot of them kind of shared many of those systems back and forth, though.
Gotcha. Before we get to Irish, I also wanted to, on the subject of taxpayer money, it's not free that this stuff gets stored, right, and maintained. That comes at taxpayer expense as well. So when someone tells you, expresses concern about, this stuff sitting in storage or about taxpayer money being spent for Ukraine, there's that other angle of it that that a lot of people don't end up talking about. And ultimately, when this stuff expires, it does have to be destroyed, which is also has the cost associated with it. So, quick point there. So I'm not sure if it was Intel or Irish next.
Irish.
Yeah, just closing out that T64 thing. I'm sure I read that, like, because they've got like 600 that they could make like 200 of them, just with the parts that they already have by breaking the other ones down. So, like, I think that they were going to upgrade them. Like, I thought Poland had already committed to doing that.
All right, Crimson.
I think was Intel before me, or
Yeah, I'm sorry, Intel. Yep, my bad.
Yeah, I was just looking at so ISW just put out an hour ago their interactive map just as an update. I know yesterday or the day before, we were talking about to the south of Bakhmut, the dam that the Ukrainians took over. So today's update, make sure, 29th, the Deputy Defense Minister, Hannah Malar, reported that Ukrainian forces advanced 1,500 meters in this direction. Just looked on Google Maps, or Google My Maps, and drew a line from the dam, just like, all right, 1,500 meters, that's 0.92 miles. How far is that? That is literally the entire town. And then some. So 1,500 meters would be across the railroad tracks. If you're looking at the, I can never get the name of this town right, so I'll just spell it out: Kurdymivka. We know that they were at the dam a day or two, like a couple days ago. So if you are looking at that from the dam, which is on the canal, it's literally the entire town. There's like a little salt, some sort of like rock salt thing, quarry on the opposite end of town. That's pretty much where the Ukrainian forces have advanced to, which is halfway to the TO 513 highway, which goes right into the center of Bakhmut. So good advances on the southern flank of Bakhmut.
Great news. Crimson.
Yeah, so just to round out this topic about aid to Ukraine, I just wanted to say we do spend a lot of time talking about military assistance, and it's critically important because the military is responsible for protecting the people's lives. But it's not the only thing you need to run a country, even during the war. And so we have sent quite a bit of financial assistance to Ukraine, and that is critically important because the humanitarian concerns and the concerns of being able to keep the sort of facilities of the country running, even during the war, are so important, right? You're talking about, 40 million people's lives that have to be taken care of, even as the military fights to protect them. And so the money that the U.S. has sent, the money that has come in from the EU, et cetera, is critical, and we have to remember that, right? It's not just people wanting to fatten themselves on cash, right? You need to keep social services running. You need to be able to assist people who need emergency assistance, and that could mean food. It's for healthcare. It means for people who've been displaced and need housing, keeping people housed and things like that. And then the last thing I want to say on that topic is, some of you may know, my friends at the beginning of this war were in Mykolaiv. Some of them have now left. Their families are still there, and I just want to say there's no dollar amount to me that is the upper limit on protecting their families' lives. If you were to ask me how much each one of their lives are worth, they're priceless. I can't put a dollar amount on it. So when people complain about money being spent or anything else like that, just remember it's to save lives that are priceless, and it is to end the genocide.
Yeah, and then the other thing in terms of value, Patrick Fox and I have talked about this many times over the course of a year, 15 months, 16 months now, is that what's it worth to the United States national security to neuter Russia's ability to pull this crap yet again somewhere down the line? What's that worth? And here Ukraine is doing all of the fighting, all of the dying, all of the hard work, and all they need from us is the weapons and the support to be able to make it happen. What's that worth to us? So we don't have to, because we're in CC, and she's not here right now. I think we're trying to get her back in here. We don't want to have to send our kids to go have to deal with this again in 10 to 15 years. We've done this twice. With a kinetic war in Europe from the United States standpoint, and a Cold War on top of that. And, the Russians didn't get more trustworthy since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And and it's at what point this is a freaking bargain. With no American forces with boots on the ground, we're getting off. We're getting off, and it's not just for the United States. It's for really freedom all over Eastern and Western Europe, right? I mean, we've seen this movie before. Strategic Jane, co-host privileges, and then Wolverine.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, the one thing I'd say is you were both right. Crimson and Brian, this is a war that is a deal at any price for the United States. Given that it weakens Vladimir Putin, and it does everything both of you have said. I'm not gonna, reiterate, but if you add together both the social side of things, the humanitarian side of the equation, the military side of things, and look at how the Ukrainians have fought what should have been an impossible fight for them, if you think about it. Really boggles the mind that we are where we are now and they are still fighting along and really doing an extraordinary job in a very dicey situation with the Russian government on, sort of halfway to capsizing, it seems like, and that's going to be a drama that's going to go on for a while. But I think this is something that if any lawmaker in the United States doesn't believe this is something that we need to do, they are not thinking much more past the end of their noses. Thanks.
I love that imagery of capsizing. I'm going to totally steal that. Wolverine.
So the only thing I did want to say on that one, and I think Crimson can be able to confirm it, but yeah, even though we are giving up a lot of this equipment, we do actually get a certain amount of money back from that whole big fund that they have with the U.S. and the EU, and that is actually a lot of that is is paying for it, and also there's the Lend-Lease. So a lot of the equipment and the stuff that we're anything that's not gifted, a lot of this other equipment that we're sending, we will actually either get it paid back right away or via the Lend-Lease and however that's set up. So it's not like we're sitting there and saying, hey, we just dropped 6.2 bill for these guys and we're not getting it back. It's actually inaccurate. We are actually getting I don't know if we're getting the whole face value back.
To say nothing of those HIMARS and the stuff that's being replaced. Those plants are being run by American workers. They're employed American workers. They're paying good paying jobs that are pouring money back into the economy. So and at the end of the day, folks, I mean, we all know what's next, right? I mean, China is watching. China is watching this 100% in terms of not only how we initially responded, but how we the sustainability of the free world's response to this. And so, because they've got their eyes on Taiwan, so if we want to send them, there's another part of this too, and we show weakness and lack of persistence on this, then this is an enabling, potentially a much more near peer conflict. I'm no military expert, but given what the Russians have done up to this point, I do have a corollary question to Erlif. So, Erlif, as you could argue that some of the better trained troops in the Russian military, the VDV, Spetsnaz, some of those special forces guys and people that were just thrown into that Hostomel airfield. If I remember the first days of watching this in the first days of the war, those guys got chewed up. And the Russians been using, some of those forces as infantry, and I've heard some of the military guys talking about it. Are you seeing, in your contacts, with the Russians, are you noticing? Obviously, an artillery shell is gonna hurt, regardless of who fired it. But are you noticing a degrading of the performance of the forces that you're going up against, in compared to like what you might have seen a year ago?
So we faced professional army. Wagner was taking care of the artillery in our area at the time that we were deployed. That's in Velikonovosilka or around Pule. So they were much better than what we had seen at the beginning. They were motivated. They were sending fucking tanks and reconnaissance and like they were doing a proper job. It was obviously a positional warfare with the probing operations and reconnaissance, etc., etc. At the time, so they were doing things right, but they still made mistakes that we capitalized on, and it was a totally different ambiance where they were not trying to bypass. It was literally positions against positions. Who had the balls to go out there and probe and try to locate targets and designate these targets, etc., etc. So yeah, they were much better. Now they've been obliterated in that area. which makes my heart happy, to be honest, because we held the fucking line for such a long time there. It's really great to see that the Ukrainians cleared what they had to clear. But yeah, much better than what they were at the beginning. Because they just walked into ambushes. They didn't really know the terrain. We were prepared, especially when you're ambushing and defending. If you do things right at short range and you have a proper kill box with people who keep their head cool, you will succeed and you will obliterate everything. So yeah.
Gotcha. Well, I know that it is very late in Erlof's time, and we are actually about 52 minutes past what I had originally envisioned for this space. So I wanted to, and also, national media already went to bed a little while ago. So, but Erlof, and I want to thank you for spending so many hours with me, because you were in my space earlier this afternoon before we started this space. So I want to thank you. It was really, when I got rolled out of the rack this morning, I didn't know we were going to have access to you in this space. So I just want to thank you. So if you want to jump off and go get some sleep, feel free to do that. You've earned it. You earned it before you talked to me. So thank you so much for your time, and I know all the people in here that have been in this space, appreciated your insights. And it's not often that we get to talk to frontline folks. And Godspeed to you and your unit. And please tell them that we all are behind them, and we wish you all good luck. And we'll buy you a beer at the Crimea Beach Party when we see you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Very warm welcome, and I'll pass the message. Thank you, and hi, Wolverine. By the way, very good analysis all the time. You know what you're talking about.
Yes, Slava Ukraini.
Heroям слава.
I just want. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you from a fellow Canadian. It's always great to see Canadians out there doing what they can and representing here as well. So bonjour, merci, and thank you.
Merci beaucoup, son.
So, we have released our friend Norm Haluf to go get some good sleep. And if anybody else wants to come up and say some parting words, or to ask some questions while we have the panelists here, that would be welcomed. I've got a little bit of gas left in the tank here. But if not, then we can kind of start to wind things down. One of the things that, there's a quote. I never thought I'd be quoting Ronald Reagan, but there's a quote actually that I've been using a lot when people have questions about why the United States is involved. So I'm just gonna kind of pull this up, because I keep coming back to this quote. And actually, Stanley Mott, I have to give him credit for I don't actually have this on my phone, but it's essentially, I think I can actually recite most of it by heart, where he said that we Americans have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here in Europe than to ready to protect the peace, instead of retreating blindly across our shores, only to return when freedom is lost. isolationism shall never, was never and never will be an acceptable response to aggression with an imperialist intent. So it's almost, I think I've got that almost 100% correct. And I think that's a good way of phrasing that. We're not going to go through this again. We're gonna end up this crap in the bud early this time, and so. Michael Bond is actually starting his open source intelligence discussion space. It's more of a intelligence review. It's very well sourced, very well hosted. Lots of good codes, lots of good panelist speakers there. It's not specific about Ukraine, although there is a lot of Ukraine content in there. There's also some talks about some other things as well. So I recommend you give him a follow and go to his space if you've got the energy left for some more space activity this evening. But I want to thank you all for, I guess, we're sitting here, almost 4 hours now, and we're at still 53 people in here. So I appreciate you guys pulling up. The panelists that are here on here, these speakers, definitely recommend you to give them a follow. Give my friend Regina a follow. CC, I see you down there. I give CC a follow as well. A lot of good folks in here. A lot of good information. If you want to pull down some of the post tweets from the Nest for your reading offline, feel free to do that now. I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that now, because when I close the space, the Nest goes away. So feel free to do that. To hang on if you want to review some of that material later on for your enjoyment. So again, thank you to all of my co-hosts who participated. Thank you to Cindy and to Strategic Jane. Thanks for coming in and co-hosting. We had a little bit of a churn on the co-hosting side, but yeah. So. And also give CC a follow. CC's had some things going on today. It's kind of busy on the home front. So give CC a follow. She's got some good stuff on her timeline regarding advocacy with your local representatives, member of parliament, or your a congressman or senator. She has a lot of great information there, good advice. So so definitely give her a follow on that. And again, thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to go get probably a chicken sub now. I haven't had dinner, so but yeah, I'll appreciate you guys coming, and you guys have a good evening, and Slava Ukraini.
Aaron Slava, and thank you, Brian, for hosting such a great space. I wasn't here for all of it, but I was listening on the computer as well. It's always great when you're here and you have these spaces. You always have such a great, informative crowd that comes. So I appreciate you doing such a long space and taking the time out of your day to do this and scheduling it. And I look forward to seeing your next one coming up. And I'll definitely set a reminder for that one as well. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome to all, and I appreciate you all pulling up. Everybody did, all the listeners, and we got a lot of great questions and stimulated some good dialogue. So, all right, guys. Well, you guys take care, and you have a great evening.